Hello and welcome back, guys. We're now starting a new story, Coping with Chaos, and a Weapon or Two, written by CYN1 Calst 4R. You can find his profile link in the description. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Reasonable Reactions. Blinking his eyes open, Izuku came to terms with the fact that he had woken up. His all-might alarm clock on his dresser, long since permanently wired not to work, had conditioned him well to wake up early enough to slam his hand down in it to halt its incessant blare every week morning. He gave a final sigh of indignation at his waking's insistence before forcing himself up to his feet and dragging his body over to his closet. Well, as close to a closet you can get when its only contents are a couple on-the-nose shirts and undershirts, a pair or two of trousers, his school uniform, some underwear, and a first aid kit. All in all, it was more a storage area with a drawer used for its original purpose, but that didn't matter much as Izuku haphazardly pulled his uniform on, discarding whatever he fell asleep in onto the floor in the process. Once he'd managed a reasonable excuse for a uniform, he traipsed out of his room, making his way slowly through the rest of the silent apartment to the kitchen, finding the fridge and cabinet surprisingly refilled. Not that Izuku's complaining, of course, as he reached for a couple eggs nearer the front of the fridge and various fillings. Pulling a pan and chopping board out, he quickly got to dicing up some ham chunks and slicing a scallion before mindlessly cracking the eggs and whisking them together, going through the general motions needed until he had an excuse for an omelette in front of him. Slowly eating, he finally began to think about what his day may hold. Firstly, there's groceries, which means Mom will be home more frequently until they are near used up. That could be good. Izuku had been missing her for a while, although it's unlikely he'd be able to hold his mother's attention well enough to carry a conversation longer than pleasantries without her derailing into shouts. Secondly, he had school today. Unusual concept to be as completely dreadful as it is, but as a concept it terrified him nonetheless. This is because school meant people. Teachers. Classmates. Kaken. All in an enclosed space with him for one too many hours for it to ever end well. Pushing down the last quarter of the omelette, Izuku quickly urged the images of these from his mind and pushed the plate into the sink. That was an issue for future Izuku. Right now he allowed the thud of his backpack being placed on his back ground him as he took a deep breath and stepped outside. 15 minutes. It took 15 minutes for someone to shove Izuku almost out of his chair. Almost, because he knew well that if he made any noise by hitting the ground he'd have the teacher's jeering insults to face alongside his classmates' grating laughter. Regardless, he steered his way through the day, keeping his mouth shut as Kaken hurled insults or his teacher ridiculed his cheated test results. Which inevitably only set off Kaken more as the one kid in the class who could say for a fact that Deku had done better than him and everyone else without the thought of cheating even crossing his mind. And, well, that just wouldn't do. To cut that short, Izuku ran home, flying through far too familiar alleys at near breakneck speeds, his bag landing against a new bruise with each step as all too familiar taunts echoed dully behind him. Eventually, Izuku ended up quietly pushing his way through his front door, having managed to lose his pursuer somewhere around a few minutes away. The chatter of his mother's voice rang through the apartment, as Izuku strained to hear what was going on as he crept his way towards his room. "Are you sure? I mean, I'd be ecstatic if you came back to Japan to visit, but do you really think I'd be able to head back to the US with you? Just like that? Surely law enforcement would get involved over him being here on his own." His mother's words were like knives through his chest, a panic beginning to set in. True, his condition would make it easier. At least it'd mean no one going out of their way for him. Izuku had decided, he thought, in his panic. He yanked an old duffel bag out from under his bed. The bag had been left there to rot once Izuku realized carrying his PE uniform and his battered yellow rucksack with the rest of his things made him significantly quicker on the route home. Regardless, he began stuffing things in it in a daze, his few existing clothes quickly finding themselves lining its bottom, his first aid kit dropped on top of them as he grimaced at the little money he had. All things considered, his mother was right there, and she wouldn't notice a bit of money missing from her wallet. After all, she only went grocery shopping yesterday. Slinking from his room, he quietly slid towards his mother's bedroom in which, lo and behold, her purse was perched neatly atop her dresser. As briskly as he could manage whilst remaining unable to be heard over her wistful words down the phone, he yanked out a good 2/3 of the purse's contents in cash. Why did his mom have so much cash? Oh well. Better to go overkill than not have the money he needs, Izuku supposed. Izuku almost flew back into his room at the abrupt sound of his mother's goodbyes and see you soons down the phone, the adrenaline of the day finally wearing off to remind him of the blistering burns and aching bruises making themselves known. Cracking open the first aid kit from within his bag and sliding the money in there, he quickly strpped himself down to his underwear, beginning to unfurl the tightly wrapped and half-burnt bandages lining his arms and segments of his legs. Grimacing at the sight of the BLD coating his arms, he inspected them in an attempt to figure out what could have possibly caused that throughout the day. Ah. Never mind. He looks over his arms with a sigh, rubbing his hand against the BLD to confirm his suspicions. A poor excuse for bruises weaved their way between a few precise cuts lining his arms. A habit that probably should have stopped before it had even started, but he'd take this coping mechanism rather than half the things he'd done before at the mention of it on some quirkless support groups he'd submerged himself within. A bottle of antiseptic in one hand and a roll of bandages in the other, Izuku quickly jumped to his age-old process of disinfect, check for anything needing stitches, apply burn cream, bandage. Once his limbs and a couple odd bruises around his back and chest had been tended to, he glared up at his desk and the half-finished homework resting upon it. Oh well, no time like the present. Forcing himself into his chair, his eyes began to graze over the pages. English homework made its way to the top of Izuku's mental pile. It had always been one of the easiest for him. His mother practically dragged him to the first English tutor who would accept the quirkless once his father had left for America, presumably in some sort of wish for his return. He was a fast enough learner that by the time his mother chose to force him back out of it he already had a strong grasp on English alongside some JSL he had been taught by his particularly nice instructor who, for one of the first times an adult had, seemed to care. She had told him to call her Tommy-san as his little 5-year-old self almost burst out of his own skin, taking in the markings along her skin and the way they curled around her body, all meeting at her neck. He remembered her telling him about her quirk, the ability to borrow others' voices. He remembered the way the markings curled into her throat mid-conversation, instead sitting to form a crackling black pattern, not too dissimilar to that of a lightning scar. He remembered the woman who walked into the room with a laptop tucked under her arm and her eyebrow raised, holding a hand out to Tommy-san as she took it, giving her thanks as her voice, or the woman's voice, snapped back into action once again. He remembered most of all the hopelessness he felt on their last session, as she wished him well with a look he now recognized as sorrow and pity on her face as she answered all his questions about her quirk and let him redraw for what must have been the 1,000th time the marking on her neck, and take a couple goodbye photos with him on a small camera she kept in her room. With that in mind, he stood out of his chair, noticing he'd completed the homework in his days and pulled a small box from one of the drawers at his desk, opening it to take in the litter of images and keepsakes within it before placing it into his bag. Letting out a final, defeated sigh, Izuku walked over to click off his desk light before collapsing on his bed in the underwear he'd forgotten to change and the fresh bandages clinging to his arms. Chapter 2, Never Meet Your Idols, or however the saying goes, what AF day. As per usual, it began with Izuku waking up ridiculously early, and a little more abnormally, practically swerving around his mother's offhanded comments about his fragility, which, in all honesty, should have warned him for what he was in for today. He half ignored her, instead opting to shove about half a cabinet's worth of food in his pocket and unloading it into his bag both on the way into the kitchen to make his breakfast and the way out to clean his plate. His trip to school was quiet as always, until he had to step back into Deku's shoes by the school gate and brace himself as he could already see a leg or two poking in his path, just waiting for him to step anywhere near them. Morning classes were mundane, something that Izuku can say from experience almost never means anything positive. Other than the occasional scrawled insult on his desk or chunk of eraser knocking him in the head, not much happened other than his way too tired math teacher droning on about a lesson Izuku was confident he'd been taught about 4 times now. Lunch was, well, lunch. It consisted of the normal crammed hallways and stairwell corners that he always fails to dodge regardless of the people around him, leading to a less than humane lesson in quirk science, as the trio who had closed in on him called it, but Izuku had honestly stopped paying attention once he recognized the girl in the middle of the other two as the girl in the year above with a mild venomous quirk. Once he'd gotten out of that, he snuck into his rightful place onto the rooftop. He ended up in a fit somewhere between dry heaving and crying before near enough running to his next lesson. He spent most of history staring aimlessly at his page, only to feel the wariness that had been settling in his gut most of the day hit a peak as the teacher announced that their homeroom teacher was taking their next PRD. That, of course, had been a SHT show. As much as Izuku was sure everyone else in the class loved the inspiring talk about their futures, he very much did not like being called out on his pointless hero-hopeful attempt at coping. He also did not appreciate the hand-shaped burn raised onto his shoulder, or his drenched and scorched notebook. All in all, Izuku felt justified in his half-conscious stride as he walked home. Or, well, did, because that was when he wasn't losing the capacity to breathe because the sewer system's firstborn decided to pay him a visit. So, in his inevitable last moments, Izuku was feeling pretty set off, but as his fingertips started to tingle with an odd numbness and the pain in his seared shoulder began to fade, he decided it maybe wasn't all that bad. Or that was his line of thought until the gunk keeping him elevated vaporized with a blast that definitely bruised his back, but Izuku didn't really have time to complain about that since as he fell to the ground, any pounding in his head from whatever was left over from that venom was immediately overtaken by his skull making conversation with the F-floor. In his blurred semblance of vision, Izuku grabbed on to the first thing he could feel in an attempt to stand up again. Just as he went to figure out what he was gripped onto, he felt himself rise upright. A couple 100 feet into the air. As he let out a shrill shriek, he turned up to face whatever he'd grabbed onto, only to meet the face of F All Might. His scream seemed to shake All Might out of whatever trance he was in if the rooftop quickly meeting his feet said anything. That was incredibly foolish of you, young man. Now, I must be going. All Might scolded with a sense of urgency lining his tone. Not that Izuku noticed, of course, what with him being confidently concussed and his lungs still feeling half clogged with slime. This deliriousness must have been the thing to compel him to speak next, because before he knew it he'd already blurted out, "Wait. I have a question." Taking a deep breath, Izuku began to speak with a semblance of hope enveloping his tone. Can a person still become a hero, even if they don't have a quirk? I mean, even if I can't become anyone like you, surely there'd still be a few lives I could save. That hope was soon crushed by the sound of All Might's now nausea-inducing voice. I'm sorry, young man, but no. Izuku felt his heart drop. Without a quirk, you'd merely be a danger on the field. Why not try being a police officer instead? And that is all Izuku is left with as All Might practically disappears from the roof. He sat there on that rooftop for a short while. Tears dehydrated him further as he began crying over his internal destruction and then continued crying over the pain of his throbbing head and shoulder. Somewhere in that time, he'd found himself sat on the edge of the rooftop, legs swinging in contemplation. The thing that broke him from his contemplation was not one of the people wandering like ants beneath his gaze or the loud honking horns of office workers battling their way home through traffic, but a booming, all too familiar explosion making itself known somewhere to his right. Izuku barely even realized what he was doing before he found himself making a job of picking the lock to the door leading downstairs, and shooting like a rocket towards the explosion's source. Looping across streets, Izuku finally stumbled to a stop at a large crowd being restrained by a few heroes, keeping people away from Kaken. Kaken and that choking green slime that had him forced into its grasp not long before. Which led to two options. All Might didn't restrain the villain properly, Izuku got in his way, and this is all his fault. Not quite waiting for an answer, Izuku found himself analyzing the best he could through hazy vision and useless heroes before zeroing in on the villain's eyes. Well, if no one else is taking the obvious solution, Izuku would just have to do it himself. Darting past the heroes and crowd, ignoring the shouts from behind him, Izuku dislodged his bag from his back, taking the best aim he could and, surprisingly enough, hitting a moderately successful shot to the villain's left eye. He watched it rear back in pain. As he stumbled to retrieve the bag, listening to Kakin strangled couple breaths before he went quiet with slime once again. Giving up on hoping his bag held enough weight to do the job, Izuku decided to use the next best thing nearby as a projectile. Himself. Clawing his outgrown nails at the villain, he drowned out the texture of eyeball against his fingertips, his primary thought revolving around the explosions near enough hitting Izuku himself from just beside him. Now, if Izuku had a nickel for every time today he'd been sent flying to the ground by one of All Might's punches, he'd have 2 nickels and a concussion to show for it. Wait, 2. Izuku hit the ground with a thud as slime went splattering around him once again, only to see the symbol of peace looming where the slime once was. In his panic, Izuku quickly stumbled to his feet and took this as his cue to leave. Hand guiding him, he wandered through vaguely familiar streets and alleys, before he slid down the wall of one he recognized as reasonably close to home. Reaching into his bag, Izuku pulled out a small first aid kit. Yanking it open and pulling off what remained of his uniform, Izuku went through the motions of patching himself up once again, the lightheadedness making a quick job of canceling out the disinfectant sting or the soreness of bruises against tight bandages. The burn on his shoulder, however, really put him to work. Trying his best to stretch his arms to wrap the bandage around it was a job in and of itself, let alone finding out that the burn was big enough that wrapping the bandage around just one shoulder didn't cover it all. Great. About double the amount of bandages he needed and a very sore upper body later, Izuku managed to cover the entire burn, although he'd also taken about half his neck and torso with it on that journey. Giving up at that, Izuku slipped what you might be able to call a uniform shirt back on before continuing his half-stumble home, downing a couple painkillers as he walked that he'd managed to fish out from the box. They slowly began to kick in, making him less aware of the thrumming pain coating his body and more aware of his apartment door entering his field of vision. This, in turn, made him more aware of the muffled masculine voice coming from inside of his apartment. Because of this, Izuku turned the door open a lot more silently than usual, only for the voice to come into some sort of hyperfocus in his mind, although that had little on the emotions Izuku felt at his mother's next words. "Oh, Hisashi, I doubt Izuku will be home for a while, you know." "Nope." Rolling out of that conversation, Izuku felt an odd mix of disgust and sheer fear, feeling the few burns that didn't take a starburst form along his skin seem to flare up as he skittered quietly over to his room, flying through the doorway. Diving over to his bag, he began slamming everything from his notebooks to merchandise, feeling sick at the sight of All Might's face as he dodges his All Might collectibles, before zipping it sharply shut and yanking it shut before pulling it onto his shoulders, accidentally stumbling with a couple thuds in the process. Frozen in place, Izuku heard as silence overtook the apartment, before a pair of heavy, methodical footsteps began to make their way to his room. SHT Izuku, without a second thought, quickly made yet another incredibly reasonable decision and took the fast way down from his second-story apartment, the only evidence of his presence in the room that night being the muddy footprints on the floor. Chapter 3, Crows and NPCs. Let it be known Izuku does not recommend running what must have been 4 miles by that point on a concussion, multiple burns, bruises and other potential injuries with no medical attention whilst carrying practically his own body weight in random SHT he'd thrown into his bag. This, however, does not have much of an impact on the fact that he did it anyway. And after an hour and a half of jogging down ominous streets with maybe a third of the streetlights working on the way, Izuku has ended up at a worthy enough destination to pull himself together a bit. A 24-hour internet cafe. The place looks almost empty besides the barista beating the metaphorical SHT out of the coffee machine and a couple customers who couldn't be that much older than him sat at random. Perfect. Pushing the door open, Izuku winced at its subtle squeak, almost in sync with the barista, before walking up to talk to her. As he approached, she messed around with her bangs a bit, letting out a sigh before walking over to the counter where Izuku could now see the wires coming out of her ears and oh my god, that's so cool, what do theta da they have enough, nope. The painkillers had long since worn off and his head hurt way too much to think that hard. Oh well. Hey, what can I get for you? She said in a bored tone, leaving Izuku scrabbling to acknowledge the menu board just above her. A black coffee and a slice of cake. he replied, sounding more unsure of his order than he liked. The girl took one look at him before shaking her head with an exasperated expression and punching a couple buttons on the screen in front of her with one of her wires, and that is so cool. That is 1060 yen. The girl announced after a moment, walking towards the coffee machine and grabbing a cup as Izuku managed to retrieve 1100 yen from his bag, giving up on finding any other coins as he placed it down on the counter. The machine began to make a hissing sound as she turned away from the cup to grab the cash and awkwardly retrieve his change, Izuku standing just off to the side, messing with the bandages wrapped around his neck. He's shaken out of his little bubble by the sound of coins hitting the counter where his cash just was. He gives a short nod as he picks up the change and slides it in the first pocket he could find because there was no way he was going through that whole charade with his bag again. As the girl slid a piece of cake from the clear cabinet display beneath the counter, Izuku took in the inside of the cafe a little more. It looked like an arcade and a cafe had a one-night stand that neither of them wanted to deal with the aftermath of, but he liked the vibe. The neon signs over the walls and the corner booths that he'd pay any amount of money at this point to curl up in and pass out for the night really sealed the deal. But that would be a bad idea, since he was still pretty confident his head got a little scrambled in his and All Might's impromptu meetups. He could also faintly make out some music in the background. It sounded like it was supposed to be much louder than it was being played, probably something from the pre-quirk era judging by the lack of quirk-based enhancements made to the music. Izuku liked it that way, it felt a lot more genuine. He was also pretty sure this was the barista's playlist. It sounded like something she'd listened to, whatever that meant. Speaking of the barista, she was just rising from where she'd been hovering over his coffee next to the machine and placed it on the counter. He quickly reached out to grab it, before he noticed a little doodle of a crow on top in some sort of white chocolate sauce. Izuku felt himself smile a little, before turning to face the barista as he grabbed his cake. Thank you, but, why the crow though? Izuku's words stumbled out over each other as he braced for fear of sounding rude, although the girl seemed relatively unfazed. I don't know, I draw on people's drinks. Sometimes if I'm bored. You reminded me of a crow, I guess. She quickly took in Izuku's baffled expression and continued, not that that's a bad thing, crows are pretty neat. My neighbor said one off the other week and now all the crows in the neighborhood keep stuffing twigs through her bedroom window. Izuku can't help but snigger with the girl at that. He decided she could be a pretty good friend if he made it that far before she found out he was quirkless. At that thought, he nodded his thanks and took a seat in that blessed corner booth, only one table nearby being occupied by what looked to be a very focused gamer. That's fine by Izuku. Now, some may think Izuku was being dramatic when he decided this, however in that moment he stood firm in his belief that either that barista or the white chocolate delicacy she had been equipped with were made by some higher being, because it had to have been the best thing he had ever drank. Deciding to make himself of use here, he quickly pulled out his laptop as he took the first sip of his coffee, the bitter darkness he'd gotten used to being cancelled out by the sweet crow-shaped drizzle. As he sips the drink, he begins to scroll through apartment listings in the area he had now discovered he was. It was a slightly sketchier side of Muzutafu, but beggars can't really be choosers here, so Izuku took in just about everything he knew about himself, the amount of money he had on hand, and his capacity to get a job, and continued on with the strenuous task of scrolling through endless, albeit now slightly narrowed down by budget, apartments nearby. After about 15 minutes with mild success at best, Izuku finally spotted something not unfortunately expensive, although this time it was really the opposite end of the scale. Pondering on his options for a minute, Izuku eventually gave up and submitted a request for a viewing, figuring that if anyone was going to accept a random 14-year-old taking an apartment from them, it'd be somewhere like this. Huffing and rubbing at his eyes, he finally turned to his cake that had been waiting just beside his laptop. He made quick work of grabbing the fork beside it and using it to cut off a small chunk of the cake, before placing it with some sense of grace into his mouth, before that grace completely disappeared, leaving an Izuku-shaped puzzle of bliss in its wake. Izuku has now decided he has found his new favorite cafe. The devil himself would have to drag Izuku out of here by an arm and a leg. This positivity, however, soon dissipated as he caught sight of the All Might keychain hooked onto his bag. A look of annoyance and disgust crossed his face before he reached for the keychain and yanked it off, walking over to the nearest bin, dropping the keychain in there. With a huff of indignation, Izuku turned around to walk back over to his food, only to find the person who had been sat paying far too much attention to his device just moments ago watching him with a look of curiosity behind tangled, bluish-silver hair, crimson eyes darting across his tense form as if searching for something there. Is everything all right? Izuku mumbled out as he froze in place, trying to figure out how worth it'd be to just turn around and walk out instead of having to pass the guy to get to his corner booth. Aren't kids like you supposed to be some dedicated hero worshippers? What was that for? The man's scratchy voice emerged, a quality of genuinity somewhere within it. A bubble of irritation emerged within Izuku at the claim, not quite being able to shake it as he spoke. I'm in a 24-hour cafe in the middle of the night drinking black coffee and covered in bandages. When did I scream hero-loving naivety again? Izuku lets out a huff before realizing what he had said, and he was just about to take it back, to apologize and brace as he did every time he didn't mind his words, before the man started laughing. Interesting, and what would induce such hatred here? The man seemed to be near whatever he wanted to hear because he'd tucked his device into the front pocket of his baggy black hoodie. That's a story way too long for how much my legs ache from standing right now. Izuku admitted honestly, regretting his mode of transport for most of that day. Then let's take a seat. I'm happy to move to your table. Izuku did not have the energy to protest, instead dragging himself past the man and back to his seat, taking a bite of his cake as the chair opposite him began to creak. He seemed to survey Izuku for a moment, before getting completely sidetracked by something else. Hold on, is that a Stardew Valley pin? Izuku felt baffled for a moment as he watched this mildly creepy guy shape-shift both in personality and posture into some angsty teenager. Yeah, I got it ages ago online I think. Why, you play? Izuku's tone came out more doubtful than he anticipated, but the guy seemed too deep in his own suppressed excitement to care. Obviously. I mean, I play a lot more action fusions but being up at midnight playing Stardew Valley. As much as it annoys Sensei, it really can't be beat. The boy began to ramble and Izuku suddenly felt just a bit more alone listening to it. I like a lot of games, too, although the ones that last a while whilst still having purpose are amazing. Izuku commented, only to send the person opposite him off onto another spiel about various different games, before he jumped onto a topic of a new game that he decided he had to show Izuku, pulling his device from his pocket and tapping a couple icons before loading up what looked to be some indie adventure game, citing the name, Intertwined, Chapter 2. The man stayed incredibly faithful to spoilers, sharing essentially nothing about the game before sitting there stubbornly as he watched Izuku go to download it on his laptop. He should probably ask for the guy's name, Izuku decided. Thinking of him as, the man, just felt kinda rude. Give me your phone. I wanna make sure you play the game. The man huffed, reaching a hand out expectantly. Midoriya merely shrugged and handed him his slightly old phone, still wearing its clear phone case and holding a picture of him and Kaken at a phone booth from when they were little. The man quickly tapped a name and a phone number in, keeping his pinkies raised in a gesture that Izuku quickly decided was quirk-related instead of snobby. Here, message me or something. Izuku quickly did so, typing out a new message under the contact Shigaraki Tamura. Izuku shook with excitement as he typed, the thought of having a contact to actually use his phone for almost felt foreign. He heard Shigaraki's phone ping, and saw the man pull it out of his pocket to look. You hello, laughing face, Midoriya Izuku, of course you type like that. Shigaraki mumbles before saving the contact. His phone then pinged again, this time with a contact saved as Kurojiri. He let out a huff before looking up at Izuku. That's me gone, make sure you play the DMN game, got it NPC. Shigaraki grumbled to Izuku as he stood. I'll make it a priority, Shiggy. At that, Shigaraki's face flicked to something about to retaliate, before an unrecognizable emotion and then defeat, shaking his head as he walked out the door. Turning back to his laptop, Izuku minimized the new app and instead began to scroll through the news, wary of the potential for his face to show up. Sludge villain indecent leaves traumatized teen terrified. Villain of slime attempts to kill middle schooler. Brave Aldera. Student faces villain. Famed Tokyo vigilante finally caught. Sludge incident leaves Civ. Izuku paused as he scrolled back up. Vigilante. Why didn't he think of that sooner? If heroics wouldn't take him legally, that's just the route he'll take. And besides, he already knows a thing or two about the underground from analyzing underground pros like Eraserhead, of whom has now claimed a first-place spot at his personal hero rankings. Well, Izuku knows what he's going to be researching for the rest of the night. Chapter 4, Home Sweet Home. Izuku stretched awkwardly, wincing at the feeling of bandages stuck to his skin as they tug with the motion. By this point, he'd been sat in that corner booth for hours, so long that the barista from earlier had been swapped for two new ones, both cleaning various things behind the counter as he rose to his feet, bags in hand. For some reason, the people who'd had that apartment listing up were awake and responded to him at about 1 a.m., which is probably another red flag, but if anyone were brave enough to question the exhausted boy at this point, Izuku would simply say that red is his favorite color, despite it most definitely not being, considering the memories that resurface at it. Izuku gave a quick nod to the two baristas as he pushed the door open to the cafe, his phone open on a map in hand, although he wasn't really looking at it, since in his excessive amount of time in the cafe, he'd memorized the route he'd need to take to get to the apartment. He took in the area as he walked, acknowledging the rows of boarded-up buildings, before glancing around to the small clumps of nature emerging unkempt from where gaps in the tiles allowed them. Now that Izuku thought about it, he'd read online somewhere a couple years back about a villain with a nature quirk who'd been around here. He wasn't really interested in the villain, but the takedown was one of the most public arrests ever actually credited to Eraserhead, so Izuku read it all in hopes of finding more information for his analysis. As he walked further, the area started to look a bit nicer, which was positive. It seemed like the kind of place he lived. Or, well, used to live. It wasn't quite a hub for criminals like some places, but Izuku also wouldn't say it was a neighborhood like the one Kaken lived in. Regardless, he began to feel a bit better through the walk as he passed a couple people on the way. He ended up crossing paths with 5 people on the way. He first passed a gruff, ordinary-looking father with a young girl with pointed ears and a reddish tinge to her fingertips on his back. She ended up staring at Izuku's hair as he passed, something akin to stars in her eyes as she looked. He then passed a group of girls about a minute or two away from his destination. He wasn't really paying much attention to them, too distracted by nearby alleys, although he certainly started paying attention once one of the girls swerved backwards as he was crossing them and he ended up with a definitely unintentional face full of glitter. It had been a very odd conversation talking to anyone near his age, let alone a group of girls, so it took him a while to assure the girl with shimmering hair that he was alright, only for one of her other friends, of whom had bluish scaly skin with the occasional blotches of white to throw her over her shoulder and oh my god she was tall, and walk off muttering something to the girl over her shoulder about, he said he was fine, let him be, Emmy, whilst the other girl, probably sisters with Glitter Girl judging by their eyes, bowed sheepishly to him before shaking her pitch black hair out of her face and scampering to catch up with her friends. That is when Izuku started running, because as much as he'd left early, he really didn't want to be late to get this apartment ordeal over with. Finally turning his last corner, Izuku saw the complex come into view. It didn't look too bad, in fact it looked a little too nice for the area, leaving Izuku waiting for the catch. Just as he showed up, a spindly man dressed in what looked to be an attempt at professionalism approached him. Kajimori, right. We spoke over email last night. Izuku almost stood confused for a second before he thanked his half-asleep self for remembering to use a fake name. Yep. Right, well, if you'll follow me the apartment is just up here. The man turned and began walking, not even checking if Izuku was anywhere near following. Of course, after a moment's hesitation, Izuku shot into action following him with a shrug of his shoulders. They entered the main building, ending up in a once again, respectable reception area. There were mailboxes to the wall next to him and an elevator opposite that, the walls painted a steely gray color. He was next taken towards a set of stairs by the elevator, where they both quickly ascended, Izuku seeing only one person as he went. However, the stature and expression of that one person told him just about everything he needed to know. This place was probably a front. A front or a drag den, that's for sure. Izuku honestly didn't think he minded that though, at least he minded it less than the way too long staircase on his aching legs. Eventually, the man turned right into a hallway, walking with purpose before stopping in front of a door labeled 7H. Gesturing towards the door as he unearthed a key from his pocket and opened it, the man began to speak. "This is the one you were looking at." "Not much, but I'm assuming that's not a vital concern." The man prompted with a slight sternness to the end of his voice that made it sound more statement than question. "That won't be a problem," Izuku assured, following the man into the apartment and looking around. As soon as he entered, he was greeted with a sitting area in front of him and a kitchen to his right, both connected through an archway with a half-wall separating the kitchen from the entrance hallway. Bedrooms on the left, bathrooms on the right. The man grunted, vaguely gesturing to two doors on either side of the room. This is how pretty much the entire viewing went, a loop of the man half grumbling something out, and Izuku responding in a way that he attempted to make sound less eager than it would have. Eventually, however, the viewing came to a close with Izuku in an office on the bottom floor, signing a couple contracts, eyes skimming over them as he did so. The only thing that really caught his eye was the line stating that he was not to report anything he heard in the building, but that was probably to be expected. Despite that, he still scrawled his fake name into the boxes at the bottom of the pages, his eyes almost closing on him as the allure of sleep stood impending. "Alright, you're all set. Come down to this office if any issues arise." And with that, the man set 3 identical keys down onto the table towards Izuku, rose from his chair, opened the door and walked out. Kind of weird, but who was Izuku to talk about weird? Shaking his head, Izuku stood and made a beeline for the elevator, lugging his bags into it awkwardly. Pressing the button for floor 7, Izuku sort of listened to the jingle in the background of the elevator, watching the numbers tick up on the screen just above the elevator door. Izuku had never used elevators very often, since the one at his old complex always seemed to be broken, but he really left himself no time to look around as he jogged down the hallway, jamming one of the keys, speaking of which, Izuku had no idea what he was going to do with the other 2, into the door and swinging it inwards, dumping his bags over the half-wall onto a counter and breathing a heavy sigh as he got to work pulling things out. Izuku, after much inner debate, chose to start slow, shoving foods into cabinets, leaving the longer-lasting foods towards the back before pulling out a string of cheese to reward himself for his efforts and promptly passing out on the sofa. Chapter 5, Letting Izuku Cook, and Other Things You Shouldn't Do to Ensure Your Own Safety. For someone who just spent the entirety of late morning and early afternoon passed out on a sofa, Izuku's neck hurt significantly less than anticipated. His current issue, however, was his most definitely far too old bandages that were making some odd attempt at strangling him. He stretched out to his feet with a sigh, before turning to his bags and bracing for whatever mess he'd have to crawl through to find his first aid kit. Padding over into the kitchen, Izuku actually found himself pleasantly surprised. The only real mess was the bag sprawled across the counter, a couple items of clothing in random places, was that his sock in the cabinet, and a cheese string wrapper placed on the stove. Izuku by this point had decided that if this complex wasn't busted for something soon, he'd probably end up burning it down before they had the chance to, and not on purpose either. Shrugging his shoulders nevertheless, he got to work fighting the black duffel bag sat on the counter in hopes to access his belongings, eventually fishing out the familiar bright red box. Wandering towards where he was fairly certain the bathroom was, Izuku got to work peeling off his shirt, grimacing at the mess he'd made of the bandages underneath. Not that he was confident they were very good to begin with, he only really half remembers putting them on, and even what he could recall has him cringing. Gently tugging the material away from his skin, making sure to check he wasn't tearing skin too badly in the mirror, he began around his legs where the injuries weren't quite very severe save for a few scrapes and light burns, before winding his way up his body before hitting the bandages around his shoulder. He didn't really think he wanted to take it off, because that would just make it that much more real. Of course, he'd received burns before from all sorts of quirks, but Kaken had never done anything to elicit quite the smell or sensation Izuku felt when he'd received this one, and that left room to question Kaken. Question the hero everyone had painted into his future, question the words Izuku repeated like a motto since BRTH, and that's not something Izuku quite wanted to consider. Gripping the end of the bandages, Izuku closed his eyes and began to unravel them. The process was tedious and painful as it is, let alone trying to do it with his eyes closed, so Izuku ended up taking a lot longer than he probably needed to. Dropping the bandages to the floor, he gripped onto the bathroom sink before opening his eyes, turning to face himself. Izuku was unsurprised. Most of the bruises had stopped swelling too badly, although all an array of blotchy purples and blues that looked far worse than they felt. But that might have been painkillers at work. Had he taken any recently? There were a lot of cuts and scrapes which, aside from the tightening, precise lines across his forearms, looked worse than they actually were. Nothing was infected, which was a good sign. He had burns lining his body from the fires and explosions trying to save Kaken. There was a pretty large one by his upper arm, which is weird because he never actually felt it before now. Maybe he got it when he was led on the ground. This almost led him down a pipeline of thought towards All Might, a pipeline he wasn't really a fan of considering the amount of active collateral, so he instead took to looking at his shoulder. It was bad. It was red and irritated at best, and on the brink of an infection, if not already there. Good to know his concussed bandage skills weren't as good as he first thought. Regardless, he got to the meticulous process of cleaning the burn, gritting his teeth at the feeling of the antiseptic spray hitting the wound. Quickly enough, he'd managed to do what he saw as a half-decent job at cleaning it before eyeing up his burn cream. Izuku couldn't really be bothered to apply it quite frankly, and he was also half confident you weren't supposed to apply cream onto infected burns, or something like that. He honestly wasn't all confident in his medical knowledge, but he hadn't died yet, so he must have been doing something half right. Taking one end of the bandages in his mouth, he began to work on wrapping up his shoulder, beginning with a couple loops around his shoulder before moving to wrap it around his neck and chest in an attempt not to risk an infection any more than he already had been. Eventually, he repeated a similar process with his arms and right leg, the left one consisting mainly of bruises and redness, so as Izuku muttered to himself, "Don't fix something that isn't broken." Leaving the bathroom, haphazardly tossing the waste into the bin by the kitchen on the way, Izuku dumped his first aid kit back in his bag before allowing himself to stop for a moment, and finally noticing his less than happy stomach. He felt somewhere between sick, probably from his last activity, and starving, probably because he doesn't know what a normal routine is. With a sigh, Izuku pulled an empty notebook from, this time, his yellow backpack, before placing it on the counter with a pen. If he's going to waste so much time making food, he might as well do something useful whilst he does so. Izuku checks the cabinets, looking through the variety of random things he'd lined it with. He felt a familiar gnawing feeling at the back of his mind as he did so, a strong reminder of how he spent his life before it all went to more SHT than it was prior. He felt himself already documenting how much food he had, how long it'd last, how long he could last with it until he put either some of his cash to getting more or he managed to get more. It probably wasn't an amazing habit, he supposed, but he'd survived so far with it. Checking the time on a small clock hung on the wall, Izuku contemplated what to eat. He'd slept at an awkward enough time that it was now almost 5 p.m., so that ruled out any sort of breakfast by pure morality. There were a couple cans in the cabinets. He figured he could probably do something with those before breaking into the more long-lasting foods. Set on his decision, he began to pull cans out at random. Eventually, he ended up with a variety of canned vegetables and, begrudgingly enough, some rice from one of the smaller bags he'd managed to fit into his own. Izuku was a bit annoyed that he didn't have any meat with him, but he'd survive. Flicking the stove on, in a pan just next to it, he dumped a variety of tomatoes, kidney beans, sweet corn, oddly enough, and whatever else he could use to fill the pan, before chucking it onto the stove and half mixing it with a wooden spoon, half doing what he could to not burn himself whilst looking for the cabinet by the stove that he remembered having some basic seasonings in it, eventually retrieving them before haphazardly tipping them in varying proportions. Once he felt brave enough, he darted away from the stove, reaching into the refrigerator to pull out some of whatever loose veg he'd picked up before his escape. His hand left a couple seconds later as he ran over to stir the post again, taking in a couple carrots and oddly enough, a leek. When did he get a leek? Actually, what food did he even pack? Following every safety measure ever, Izuku used one hand to stir the pot over the stove, and his other, empty, hand to make half a job at chopping up his vegetables. Somehow not setting anything on fire, Izuku managed to make a half-decent near stew, albeit he forgot to make the rice he was going to add to it until after, but that's something he's willing to deny. He'd definitely made way too much stew, and maybe forgotten that rice expands, but that was safely tucked away in a large container in the fridge. Oh well, at least he didn't need to be trusted at a stove too often with that tucked away. Setting his bowl down on the coffee table perched in front of his sofa, he settled himself on the floor in front of it, finally turning to face his notebook. Taking a mouthful of the food and relishing in the fact that it somehow tasted good, Izuku flipped open the notebook to the first page. During his late-night vigilante researching spree, he decided that he should not only get a hold on his diet, which was incredibly lacking looking at his meal history these past few days, but he also needed to start training. Izuku wrote notes as he pondered, chewing thoughtfully. He probably didn't need to do an excessive amount of work on anything endurance, speed, or agility, but he also thinks a 5-year-old could probably beat him in a fist fight, so there's also that. He could probably learn how to fight half-decently, but he wanted to jump into this pretty soon before he freaked out, so he'd need a different option. Maybe he could make something. He used to be pretty good at messing around with machinery, what with always having to fix his old electronic merch since he didn't have anything to buy them new. Taking another couple mouthfuls, chewing with minimal grace around the rice, Izuku started to think about where he'd even get anything for vigilantism. One part of him wanted to be decked out in tons of gear, but another part, the funnier part, kind of wanted to just show up one day in his white shirt with the word dress shirt written across the front and kick butt. Well, wherever the fates take him, he supposes. After a moment, Izuku decided to start his workout with a run. Picking up his finished bowl and tipping it to drink what was left of the stew, Izuku dropped it in the sink for future him to deal with. If he were to go out on a run, he'd be able to get to know just where he is, and he might even find some materials. Before that though, he reached into his duffel bag to pull an undershirt beneath the one he had on right now with the words "socks" printed across it. He figured displaying his bandaged wounds for all to see might not be an amazing idea. Skirting around the counter, Izuku turned back to the door, dragging on his beat-up red shoes and shoving one of the apartment keys into his pocket, before pushing the door open and stepping out. Chapter 6, Elation and Grief. Izuku's run began relatively mundanely. In fact, looking at his life the past few days, one could even call the entire journey a bit of a blessing. He first took a brisk jog around the block, taking aimless turns until eventually he distanced himself further from the building. He passed a few more people on the way, none of them paying him near any mind, going about their business as Izuku busied his mind with guesses of what they were up to. Whilst drifting off into thought about a short confident boy, Izuku hit what must have been his prayers being answered. Just that morning, or evening if you aren't running on Izuku's consideration of time, he'd been thinking about finding scrap materials, and here he was. Izuku thought he recognized the beach as he looked it over, probably from one of those worst beaches in Japan videos that plagued the online feed of the older generations, at least in his area. Quickly shaking his train of thought back on track, he began carefully treading into the beach, avoiding most of the sharp shards of metal and glass dotted around along the sand, instead heading towards the already chunked up pieces of scrap. Izuku picked up pieces at near random, wrapping his arm around them to keep them firmly lodged by his side. Eventually, once Izuku had picked up just enough pieces of metal and pulled just enough bolts and wires from other pieces that he wasn't confident he'd actually be able to carry it all back, he turned around to the way he came, suddenly glad he'd cut off his run so shortly. Now, however, people took a lot more frequently to staring at him with an incredulous look as he wandered past them with an excessive amount of metal. Izuku was completely oblivious to the looks he was receiving, walking with a light excitement on his face. He received even more awkward glances as he entered his apartment building, hoping that "don't ask, don't tell" situation extended beyond illegalities. Was this illegal? Technically it was illegally dumped there in the first place. What does it matter to him? His biggest obstacle, somehow, was his front door. Unlocking and opening it would mean having to place down all the scrap without anything to lean it on, fish through the screws in his pockets for his key, and then reverse the process once he was getting it, before doing it again once he was inside the apartment. He was set up for success, really. With a defeated sigh, Izuku crouched into a squat, slowly releasing the pieces of metal and wincing as he heard them hit the floor as well as each other. Step 1 over. Next, he shoved his hands into his pockets, not quite sure which one he put his keys in. He pulled out 13 screws, 5 bolts and a pen he didn't even know was in there before finally pulling a hand out with his key in it. Not wasting any time, wary of his neighbors who could probably hear his bullshit, he jammed the key in the door and twisted the lock, shoving it open in the process. Then, he knelt down, performing the same tedious process he did at the beach of loading the materials into his arms, only this time he didn't have to worry about various shards of glass littering the floor. He was honestly glad he'd worn his undershirt, considering the amount of times the scrap had caught against his clothes. If his bandages got unraveled during all of this, he's fairly confident he'd drop any attempt at vigilante morals to personally curse whoever hadn't thought to create anything a bit faster acting. After much trial and error, he managed to get himself through the door, dropping the metal by his coffee table with a resounding crash before turning around to close and lock his door. His neighbors not being able to question his now 7 p.m. shenanigans is certainly more of a blessing now than a warrant for suspicion. Well, now that it was here, Izuku really didn't think he could be bothered to sift through it all. Who really cares? He can always find something else to do. With a moment of thought, Izuku pulled out his laptop from where it was perched on the table, narrowly avoiding the mess lent near it. He dropped himself onto the sofa, quickly moving to load up the game he'd been somewhat forced to download, although that he found he actually quite liked after playing a bit of it the other night at the cafe. One hand resting over the WASD keys and the other hovering over the mouse pad, Izuku relaxed as the game's intro music washed over him. What the F? Izuku was currently led across his entire sofa, crying. By this point it was 1 a.m. and he hadn't stepped away from the game. Until now, of course, after they just killed off the main character's F-cat. Izuku has vowed to find a cat just to name it Pebble in honor of the name he had so meticulously picked out in the kitty's honor. There was only one real solution to this issue. Mishigi, what the F? Why did he have to die? Why was I not worthy of a warning? This is truly the end for me. Shigaraki Tamura. Oh, you are at that part. Wait, are you talking about the cat or the other guy? Izuku quickly changed Shigaraki's contact name before replying. Me, the other guy. The other guy. What does that mean? Please no. Shigatron 2000. Oh, so you mean the cat? Have fun with that. LOL. Me, Shigaraki. No, I don't think I will have fun with that. Where have you gone? Please don't leave me with this knowledge. I am grieving. Please. Eventually giving up, Izuku let out a sigh, sliding towards the fridge to ease his grievances with the blessing of a string of cheese melted over some of the rice from yesterday. Not exactly a delicacy, but he's paying more attention to plotting out how he was going to destroy the man who killed Pebbles. Wow. You ditch society to escape your abusive surroundings and move into a shady business front/potential drag den, and all of a sudden psychological warfare and eventual murder become first instinct at the death of a video game cat. Go figure. Izuku practically liked the bowl clean before dropping it into the sink, looking between the variety of dishes within it and then to the pile of metal in his living room with a pained look before walking to sort the scrap with a groan. Chapter 7. Gaming as a procrastination method. Izuku had just almost started a fight with a car door. He had lost before the fight even started. Now, however, he is led on his living room floor with a couple neatly, organized piles of scrap dotted around the place, although how they were organized was a question for another time since, considering the 8-feet-long cable and half a deep fryer basket placed next to each other, not even a higher power would be able to decipher what Izuku was concocting. The current issue though, is the car door that is led across his stomach that he wasn't all that confident he could muster up the energy to move. Despite this, Izuku let out a defeated grunt and began making a half-wriggle, half-crawl attempt at getting out from under the door, not too dissimilar to some sort of hybrid between a devastated worm and a turtle that had been flipped onto its shell. Izuku was not willing to admit how long it took him to get out from beneath the door, nor was he willing to admit that the reasonably sized hole in the side of his shirt was from giving up and rolling his way out once he was a little more than halfway free. Using the sofa for what ended up being moral support more than anything, Izuku got to his feet to look at the clock again. 4 a.m., that meant that Izuku had now spent near enough 3 hours organizing this scrap, and he knew for a fact that he spent about a third of that time in an existential void under a car door. No one here to judge him now, he decided as he padded over to his laptop, with the mental note to start putting something together as he loaded up Shigaraki's game, as Izuku had dubbed it, once again. This mental note was briskly ignored, however, once Izuku opened the game to 2 in-game notifications: quest ended, Eternal Companion new quest, Death's Lucidity Well. There went any plan of Izuku's to keep this playing session short. Instead, he clicked the second notification to enlarge it, selecting the Start button and allowing the sounds of the game to immerse him. Izuku is once again crying, however now they were definitive tears of joy, because after 24 subquests, for cutscenes, and 37 fights, 19 of which only happened due to Izuku's instigation, he was currently seeing a pale blue figure of Pebbles on his screen, meowing around his character's ankles. Instead of remaining on the game for too long, he paused it quickly and reached for his phone, pressing the screen aggressively. "Me, so was my Pebbles coming back to life not a good thing to mention? Or do you just thrive off of my suffering? Shigatron 2000 second option. You really play this quite often now. Good, glad to see someone appreciating the true experience of video games, unlike some NPCs. Me, I shall not be swayed by flattery. I was devastated, destroyed in despair. Shigatron 2000, oh god, me grieving, disillusioned. Shigatron 2000, how many words do you know? OML, me, not enough to describe the pure emotion I felt at Pebbles' death. Shigatron 2000, I still can't believe you called that cat Pebbles of all things. Anyway, there's an official livestream for a game starting soon and that takes priority here. Good luck on the game, or SMTHEW. That sounded nice. PSS off, die, me full of affection as always. By laughing face. Huffing in indignation, Izuku shoved a charger into his laptop before rising to face the piles of scrap before him with a look somewhere between exhaustion and excitement. He eventually settled on a smaller stack set on the edge of the coffee table, reaching in and beginning to pull things out of the pile, giving them a quick once-over look before nodding and placing them back onto the table, this time in another pile. After completing this process, Izuku took in the slightly more organized pile, taking a moment to admire his handiwork, procrastinate the process. He then reached into the scrap, pulling out a couple pieces of metal and bolts before getting to work. The process was strenuous at best. It took Izuku an hour to realize that he had chucked some of his DIY and construction tools into his bag in his panicked escape, and by that point his fingertips were already red and irritated from attempting to hand-screw things shut and hold them together. All in all, he ended up thanking his subconscious for the blessing of screwdrivers and getting back to work. After that entire situation, the process ran fairly smoothly, the rough material under Izuku's hands oddly grounding as he worked. Eventually, from his hands emerged a relatively well-constructed shell of something near a mask. Don't get him wrong, Izuku was aware that it held minimal practicality other than making him recognizable and looking awesome on the field, and that he had yet to attach it to an actual mask, but those are certainly not his problems. By this point, though, it had hit 6 a.m. and he probably needed to wait about an hour before anywhere in particular started to open. His fingers also hurt like hell, so he'd rather just wait until that went down a bit. Izuku, because of this, was left with nothing to do. He can't finish the mask since he doesn't have a mask to attach it to, at least not one he'd be willing to sacrifice for this, he can't game since that would require using his fingers that were already burning with hatred for him as it was, and he can't work out because he'd done enough running, lifting, and manual labor to feel like he'd been hit by a truck. Well, left him with two clear options, eating and sleeping. After a thorough debate, Izuku settled on merely doing both, one after the other, slipping a portion of that leftover stew out from the fridge as well as a reasonable amount of the rice, which he was glad he was managing to get rid of, considering how much he accidentally made. After quickly attacking the microwave, Izuku was left with a half-decent bowl of leftovers, as well as a glass of water he'd grabbed himself whilst waiting for it. He chose to perch himself cross-legged on the kitchen counter, not quite wanting to face the abomination that was the living room at that point. He had to admit, the food was actually pretty good for something that was a complete improvisation to make. Normally back at home he would eat an unreasonable amount of the prepackaged foods in the cabinets, knowing their use before dates off by heart, even recalling them as he stocked the cabinets in this apartment, yet he rarely found himself ever having to actually cook, a predicament that almost always ended up better for Izuku's stomach than the kitchen. Slowly polishing off the bowl, Izuku went over his little vigilante plan in his head again. First of all, he knew he needed to make some semblance of an outfit to wear, whether that be through his wardrobe or permanently borrowing them, he wasn't quite sure yet. Secondly, he needed a more reasonable amount of strength. Even heroes who don't rely on strength require at least some semblance of strength, after all. He kept thinking about the list as he made half an attempt at washing the dishes before turning back around to the sofa and plummeting face first into it, sleep meeting him in seconds. Chapter 8. The pasts haunting Izuku flew awake as he felt himself crash to the floor, a stark panic consuming him as he let out a quiet whimper at the newfound pain in his elbow and the way the somewhat healing wound on his shoulder felt as if it was burning all over again. He was relatively confident he could smell flesh bubbling away behind nitroglycerin-softened palms, but he was also confident that he was in his bed, and not wherever the F he was right now. Oh God, where was he? What is going on, and why can he still hear those rhythmic chants and jeers looping through his mind, trapping him against the ground he'd curled up on, ragged nails digging into his arms in an attempt to block out those words that he held as a gospel in their own right, and yet all this served was to tense his shoulder, the dull burning sensation searing even more. Everything was wrong and different, and where was he? The rough texture of whatever he had been laying on prior grazed against the back of his hand as he tried to seat himself upright, sending a flash of fear through him, only sending him crawling away into something distinctly wooden, a loud metallic crash ringing out against the floor as his head bumped into it. He needed to move, and fast. To get somewhere, anywhere away from here. He needed to find a bathroom, or a janitor's closet, or something to hide in before these voices envelope his consciousness entirely. Scrambling to his feet, he pried his fists away from his arms with a soft hiss at the pain he barely processed through the adrenaline before making a stumble of sorts towards a door across the room. Slamming down the handle and collapsing in, he slammed the door shut and leant his body up against it. He wasn't honestly quite sure what he was running from, he just remembered pain, and fear, and Kaken, and that overwhelming burning that is still embedded by his shoulder blade. Taking a firm, deep breath, Izuku managed to clear his vision enough to take in his surroundings, a sick sense of familiarity taunting him. Ignoring it almost entirely, he began to rummage through drawers beneath a sink he must have reached at some point, pulling out a large red box and a small pinkish bag placed next to it, dumping out the contents of both into the sink. The box produced several reels of bandages, some gauze, antiseptic and disinfectant, alongside some needles stacked in what Izuku assumed was a sterile tube, as well as various other pieces of equipment that he was too delirious still to attempt to name. The bag, however, left him with various bottles of what looked to be a variety of painkillers and medicines in a variety of dosages, as well as an old, beat-up lighter and a few loose razor blades littering the sink. In the process of thinking through what was in front of him, Izuku glanced up at himself in the mirror, freezing when he caught his own eye. Oh. Right. It all came flooding back to him as he took in the tear in his shirt and the now loose bandages looped around his neck, the small, crescent-shaped divots in his arms a lot more painful now that he was really looking at them, although the pain granted a sense of relief, almost. Something that seemed to dull over the voice's muffled cackling in his still throbbing shoulder. And thus, Izuku found himself alone in a locked bathroom with a mind screaming for numbness and a sink full of equipment. Izuku needed to get the F out of this house before he got any more drastic. Wrapped up in a new hoodie and a couple more bandages lining his forearm than had been that morning, as well as a BLD-covered blade he didn't think he could bear to look at laying somewhere in the bathroom, he almost forgot his key bolting out the door, red shoes nearly on properly. Oh well, at least this gave him an excuse to explore the area, that might help to clear his mind, after all. Wandering down the staircase with a distinct numbness gnawing at his emotions, Izuku seemed to fit in more than ever with the few shady individuals minding their business as they passed him. His eyes were bloodshot and lined with a darkness beneath them, his hair disheveled from exercise and the fact that personal hygiene hadn't really been his number one concern at that point. His clothes were baggy with bandages wrapped around his neck covering most of his what could have been visible skin. Hey, the bandages might be a good trademark. DMN, he'd need to invest in some more bandages. Or maybe he could just borrow them. Getting lost in his own thoughts, a state of dissociation washing over him, he barely even noticed as his feet progressed to pavement and he found himself taking a couple turns towards where he thought most of the population along the streets were coming from, eventually finding himself in a street of shops within a more well-off area. The smell of passerby's to-go cups brought him back to the 24-hour cafe. He should really go back there. Would it be creepy to scout the area to figure out when the cool barista girl's shifts were? He really didn't think he could cope without trying that coffee again. After a while of walking, idly watching the stores he passed and the people who he crossed paths with, he eventually encountered a large gate. Staring at it for a moment, he began to recognize the mural on the wall just next to it. Somehow, he had ended up at the park where he and Kaken used to play in together. Izuku found himself rushed with memories of log bridges and rivers, of running back to their mothers perched on park benches with excessively loud shouts detailing their antics, of the ice cream truck that used to be in the same place by the lake every Saturday. Before he could even really process what he was doing, Izuku found himself striding into the park, making a beeline to a bench worn almost as deep into his memories as the crude drawing Kaken drew on the back of it some decade ago was worn into the bench. Sitting down, he read the familiar memoir on the back of the bench, reminiscing with a sad expression before turning to face the area. Mothers milled around with their children, some fathers sat around picnic tables or on the lake's edge with their kids, something that spiked a sense of resentment in his heart as he remembered the way Uncle Masaru would balance them both under his arms as he played with them at the water's edge where Izuku's own father really should have been. He didn't even notice the expression on his face or the voice trying to talk to him before a few locks of blonde hair crossed his vision as a figure came to stand in front of him. "Hey, kiddo, you with us now?" The figure asked as Izuku's eyes darted around, the man's eyes softening to somewhere near pity as he watched Izuku freeze up. "Is there anyone I can call for you? Whatever wound is under your hoodie must be pretty bad, I should know, and you seem a bit out of it. Did you hit your head? Were you hurt by someone? Do I need to call you some help?" The person's expression morphed into one of increased panic as he allowed himself to continue rambling out questions, leading Izuku to cut through his panic and interject. It's okay, sir. I'm alright. You really don't need to call anyone." Izuku's voice rose in panic as he grimaced at the thought, catching the sight of BLD on his sleeves as he went to gesture in front of his face. So that was what they were talking about. The man seemed to realize something, although whatever it was Izuku had no clue as much as he'd really like to have an idea of what was going through that man's head as he sat on the other side of the bench. "I'm guessing I came off there a bit strong, hey kiddo." The man chuckled awkwardly before running one hand through his hair as a fidget of sorts and the other to gesture towards himself, his movements looking drastically slowed down. "My name's Yamada Hisashi." "Sorry for the ambush there, Yamada huffed out a laugh. "Are you sure you don't need any help? You don't look in the best of shape there, kid." Well, let it be known that this was entirely the man's fault for giving him a means of escape. "I'm really fine, sir. Thank you for the offer." Izuku rose to his feet and darted off in a flash, reaching speeds akin to those he used trying to beat Kaken's explosions, and to Izuku's surprise, the man made no attempt at pursuing him other than raising a hand in his direction as if in some last-ditch effort to catch him. Which was weird, since the man definitely could have caught him. He looked pretty well built for the average man, which would have led Izuku to think this was some kidnapping attempt if the man's hair wasn't perfect to every degree. No, the thing that led Izuku to bolting, now back on the main street and darting towards where he remembered coming in from, was that the man felt incredibly familiar, and with his track record, Izuku didn't want to handle ominously familiar people. Not that that really mattered, of course, now that he'd managed to turn the 45-minute stroll he took out into a 7-minute and 32-second sprint back. He once again thanked whichever person who added the tight-lipped lines into his apartment contract, because no one so much as raised an eyebrow at the boy storming up the stairs like his life depended on it, blood soaked into various patches of his sleeve. Throwing open his door, he tossed off the hoodie and took in the bandages that must have been cursed by the gods or something considering their ability to unravel from how tight Izuku had secured them in near enough record time. With a groan, he reached over the half-counter and pulling the last of his leftovers out of the fridge in preparation before wandering back over to the bathroom sink. Hisashi found himself stuck on the thought of that boy as he wandered home. He was, however, notoriously horrendous at hiding his emotions, leaving his absolutely amazing, awe-inspiring, love of his life husband, yes, Shoyuta, the nicknames are true and necessary, to notice him deep in his own mind as soon as he walked through the door. What happened? Shoyuta drawled out, having just awoken from his late night and early morning patrol, nursing a steaming cup of terrifyingly sweet coffee in one hand and a small bundle of cat in the other. Lemonade nipped at his scarf. Why did he have his scarf on? Why is Hisashi not surprised? Playfully, letting out a gentle trill as she acknowledged Hisashi tugging his shoes off. I don't know, to be fair. I was walking through the park, as usual, when I saw this kid on a park bench. Hisashi flopped himself onto the sofa, his dramatic antics receiving merely a mildly amused eye roll from Shoyuta. The kiddo looked sad. Like, too sad for someone his age. And then I saw BLD on his sleeve. I think I panicked and jumped the gun a bit though, the poor kid ended up turning tail and running. Hisashi melted into a puddle of dismay and defeat across the couch, leaving Shoyuta to plant himself onto the floor in thought, Lemonade happily taking to curling up in his lap as soon as she saw BSTRD approaching with curiosity. Wait for him then. If he was at the park, he's probably in the area. If you just keep an eye out for him, it's the best you can do. Shoyuta decisively told him. Yes, that was the logical decision or whatever, but Hisashi has always been a sucker for kids. He couldn't just leave a bleeding dissociated kiddo on the back burner. But, if Shoyuta says it, it's probably the best idea for now, so he will go along with his husband's idea for no reason even remotely related to how much Hisashi liked Shuta's decisive logicality. Whatever you say, Hisashi mumbled, face pressed into the sofa cushions. Chapter 9, Self-Care. Blinking the sleep out of his eyes, Izuku just couldn't get the image of Hisashi out of his head. It was odd enough that he'd not even questioned approaching Izuku, let alone that he knew that if he could just look at Hisashi a little longer he'd be able to place just who he was. Izuku had, once again, fallen asleep on the sofa. At this point, he wasn't confident he'd ever even use his bedroom. The living room's current issue was, however, the scrap metal scattered across the floor from his unfortunate incident that morning. To be honest, Izuku couldn't really recall what he'd been panicking about, not even the dream itself. He took a moment to think as he began gathering loose metal. He would hazard a guess that either Kaken or All Might was there, or maybe even both, considering how the universe was getting a real kick out of spiting him recently. They'd played pretty frequent characters somewhere in his subconscious for a while, but now that All Might's role had flipped, Izuku was stuck victim and defenseless within his own mind, which he wouldn't call a massively enjoyable experience. Dumping a couple screws on the table, Izuku quickly accepted defeat against some of the last few pieces of scrap that had taken to hiding throughout the room like their lives depended on it. They probably did, to be fair, considering Izuku's mental map of ideas for all these clusters of materials. He paused for a moment, trying to think of something to fill the time. For starters, he knew he needed to eat, change his bandages and shower at some point, so he might as well get those out of the way first. Izuku had dragged himself halfway to the bathroom until he reached a dilemma: he had absolutely no clean clothes. Oh well, that was a problem for future him, he decided as he continued his stroll to the bathroom, locking himself inside of it and choosing to ignore the F-bomb sight of a sink adjacent to the shower, instead slipping off his tattered, oily clothes and, after a short moment of debate, gently peeling off the bandages lacing his body, hissing as he felt the scabs pull themselves from some of his wounds as he had to tug a little harder to pull the bandage away. He couldn't really make much sense of his arms, considering cleaning anything away evidently wasn't his priority yesterday considering the situation he'd ended up finding himself in at the park, but he could see the awkward mess of burn on his shoulder well enough. Izuku was relatively sure that the antiseptics and disinfectant and who knows what else he'd chucked onto his shoulder had probably worked in fighting off that infection that had been rising, but Izuku decided he probably shouldn't get too comfortable considering his track record. With an exasperated sigh, Izuku now turned to face the hardest challenge of them all, figuring out how to turn the shower on. One wouldn't expect such a thing to take 7 minutes, but that was still a record Izuku was willing to set as he fought the dials and buttons until a stream of ice-cold water assaulted the back of his head, causing him to fly back in panic before twisting the knob that had a dual blue and red color across it until it reached a temperature that was a little more lukewarm than Izuku would have bargained for, but good enough nonetheless. He quickly hopped in, soon glad he'd ended up at a lower temperature as he felt the somewhere near chill soothe the burn on his shoulder, before realizing he had not, in fact, pulled shampoo, conditioner, or really anything he needed from his bag. Hopping out of the shower with much less grace than appreciated, Izuku allowed a trail of water to mark his path to the kitchen where he rummaged through one of his bags, soaking what was left of the contents in the process before successfully pulling out a few bottles of shower products. Turning around and making an even faster job on his way back, Izuku almost fell flat on his face attempting to jump back into the shower, but nobody was there to acknowledge that, so it isn't true if you ask him. With a huff of relief, he gently began the process of trying to comb his hands through his hair with shampoo, getting as far as he could be bothered and swiftly replacing it with an unnecessary amount of conditioner that seemed to do some semblance of a job compared to the shampoo. Once that had been raked through his hair, if you could even call it his hair by this point, considering it had somehow managed to slick itself back against his head, he softly began washing his body, carefully rubbing dried BLD from his arms, the cuts there stinging slightly before the sensation faded. He made his way across his body doing this before washing it off with his conditioner, finally able to get a good look at his own arms. So, they weren't the worst he'd ever seen, but he really needed to take care of them. Seemingly contemplating his life decisions on the way, Izuku switched off the shower by flipping everything back around to zero, since he had no idea how he turned it on in the first place, stepping out and wrapping himself in an old, once light gray towel of his in an attempt to stave off the cold. He ran through the motions of bandaging himself once again, letting out less of a reaction to the antiseptic sprays now that he'd had a shower than before. As he was doing so, he half acknowledged his interesting sleep schedule and its interesting effect on his diet and, by proxy, physique, taking himself in the mirror. Yeah, he'd probably need to eat a bit more consistently if he had plans on becoming a vigilante. Oh well. At the thought, Izuku wrapped his towel around his waist, careful not to jostle any new bandages as he ambushed his bag for a hoodie and a pair of trousers, before looking around his kitchen warily, unsure of what to do. He'd finished all of his leftovers, which was a travesty in and of itself, but what could he eat now? He didn't really want to open any of his perishable foods, although that consisted of most of what he had, leading to a mild conflict on that account. He knew he had multiple bulk packs of those instant ramens he'd practically memorized the flavors of. He could have one of them, since he kind of wanted something he could add a cheese string to. Hey, can't a kid have non-nutritious priorities here? Izuku had made up his mind, pulling a 24-pack of instant ramen from the cupboard, busting the bag open before yanking a smaller bag out. He sort of read the instructions on the back before shrugging to no one in particular and pulling a bowl out, dumping the noodles in as he flicked the kettle on. As the kettle boiled, he pulled a cheese string from the fridge, bouncing back and forth on his excited, although visibly more relaxed after the shower, feet, his hair having magically tangled as it started to dry, protesting his fingers from moving any further than an inch through his hair. Eventually, he heard the kettle's telltale ding, lunging for the handle and pouring what he guessed was enough water into the bowl and attempting to open the seasoning sachets with precision unseen since Earth's creation. It took him 6 minutes longer than it was supposed to, and he was covered in a good quarter of the seasoning, but Izuku was now wandering over to the sofa with a satisfied smile as he stirred the chunks of cheese in with his chopsticks. With nothing better to do with his time, Izuku pulled his laptop up to share his lap with the bowl and began loading it open as he ate. Chapter 10, Short-Term Deja Vu. Izuku needed to work out. Izuku also needed to go back to that cafe or he might literally explode. It was around 9 p.m. now. He could always sneak out for a run. Running would make sure he didn't get kidnapped or something too. See, Izuku can be optimistic too. Hauling himself to his feet and blatantly ignoring the mild ache in his neck from the less than comfortable position he'd found himself sitting in, standing up with the bowl and chopsticks in one hand, using the other to place his laptop down on the sofa, plugged in and charging as always. Izuku dumped the bowl into the sink, wary of his incredible habit of letting his dishes pile up to be taller than Kaken's ego. He stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to bring, before grabbing his mostly empty school bag and shoving his laptop into it. He'd need it if he were to bump into Shigaraki again, all things considered. For good measure, he shoved a chunk of the cash he'd gotten from his mother's purse into the bag, zipping it shut and hoisting it onto his back. He wandered around to the door, sliding on his battered red sneakers, grabbing his key and shoving it into his hoodie pocket, sliding himself out of the door and making an effort not to make eye contact with the hulking man walking past him to a room just down the hall, attempting to ignore the man's non-existent breathing or webbed fingers. Nope, not analyzing quirks right now. Get out the door. Leaving the main building, Izuku began a well-paced run towards the inverse of the path he'd memorized in the cafe last time. Fewer people passed him this time, figures in alleys preferring to pay him minimal notice through their hushed words and tense discussions. Wow, criminals were stupid. Izuku should not be able to hear a discussion planning a seemingly large drag deal as he jogged past an alley with at least 3 voices coming from it. Well, at least it'll make his life easier once he starts vigilantism, he decides as he sees his jog enter the nicer part of town that the cafe was in. Now he was simply looking out for the cafe's vibrant lights as he turned familiar corners, eventually met with the same purple lead "Open" sign across the street from him. He slowed his pace to a walk, keeping a tight grip on the straps of his bag as he crossed the road, flinching slightly at the jingle of the bell above his head as he pushed the door open. He turned to take in his surroundings, noticing once again the space being reasonably empty and hey. That's the same barista. She seemed to have the same thought as she looked at him for a moment as if she was interrogating his soul itself, before a light flashed behind her eyes as he approached. Oh, Crow boy. She nodded her head in greeting, hovering over the till in front of her as he approached. Hey. Great start. No one has the right to be that enthusiastic this late at night, Izuku decides, instead opting for a quieter approach as he continues to speak. Can I just have the same as last time please? A black coffee and a slice of cake please. Sure, you know the drill. She yawned as she tapped the order into the machine, turning to grab a glass and click a few buttons on one of the coffee machines, leaving Izuku to drop some cash as she turned back to grab the cake. You look like you've been hit by a truck. The girl remarks, leaving Izuku to stutter slightly. I'll take it as a compliment. Izuku chuckles, receiving a raised eyebrow and a snort from the girl as she reached for the bottle of white chocolate syrup and hovered over the cup of coffee. Izuku found himself incredibly excited as she did so, both for the flavor and another one of her drawings. After a minute or so of waiting, Izuku was handed a tray containing a slice of cake and a cup of coffee with a small dancing crow drawn on the top with a couple music notes around them. That was when Izuku's face found itself tinted a slight shade of red as he realized he'd been absent-mindedly bobbing his head to the music playing in the background across the cafe. Thank you. Izuku exclaimed, scurrying over to the same corner booth he'd found himself in a couple days ago. Taking a sip of the coffee and giving himself a moment to relish in the flavor, he pulled out his laptop fairly quickly. He knew he needed to brush up on his online skills a bit more. He'd picked up the habit of acquainting himself with private government databases when he found that there wasn't enough public information on a couple heroes' quirks, and it all just spiraled out of control a bit from there really. Izuku went from getting into pro-hero quirk registries to going straight to the analysis source with the city cameras, and by that point, Izuku spent enough of his time inside because of bullies that he might as well learn a bit more about hacking. It might even help him with his little engineering projects. Shaking his head, he slid back into the familiar position of clicking keys and HPSC password screens, until eventually his screen lit up with, instead of heroes, the criminal registration information, particularly ones that haven't been caught yet. Always good to have the upper hand, Izuku thought to himself as he filtered the search to his area in particular, skimming through the names, paying more attention to the higher-ranked criminals. Awfully distracted there, NPC. A voice startles Izuku out of his scrolling, only for Shigaraki's face to come into view sat opposite him across the booth with a smug smile on his face. "Ah, Shiggy, fancy seeing you here." Shigaraki raised an antagonistic eyebrow at the nickname alongside Izuku's sickeningly sweet tone. "I changed my mind, the drink can wait," Shigaraki announced, pretending to stand up from his chair before a stern stare from Izuku which looks more adorable than threatening given his current demeanor. But Shigaraki wouldn't mention that, for fear of knowing nothing of Izuku's combative skills. "So, what are you up to on that laptop that's so important, NPC?" Shigaraki inquires with a curious and slightly cunning glint in his eye. "I'm hacking into private hero commission databases in order to acquire information about villains in the area," Izuku says with an indifferent smile as he looks up to Shigaraki. "Oh, that's convenient, have I made it on there yet then?" Shigaraki asks, leaning across the table to get a good look at the screen as Izuku turns it to face him. He quickly typed his name into the search, only for nothing to show up. "Nope, nothing under your name yet. You seem way too calm about this. Should I be worried that you're on the list?" "Not yet. I'm not gonna ask any more questions." Chapter 11, Rants and Rambles, Midoriya, what the F? Izuku watched Shigaraki slam his head against the table as Izuku pulled up Pro Hero Endeavor's medical history. What Izuku thinks shocked Shigaraki the most was the fact that it was pinned to his desktop in a folder labeled Plans. "In my defense, Endeavor is the only pro I snooped this deep on. Most of them don't deserve it. I used to mail glitter bombs to Endeavor's main office with cryptic messages though, and I didn't even do that stuff to Kaken, so it's definitely deserved." Izuku attempted to justify himself to a confused but subtly eager Shigaraki. "I'm going to ignore whoever this Kaken NPC is once again, mind telling me just why you hate Endeavor?" Shigaraki had brought his fate onto himself when he prompted anything that could even remotely begin a rambling spree. "Well, firstly, he's an but," Shigaraki raised his eyebrows at the immediate explosion of passion. "I mean, I took one look at his family and that's all I needed to hit that conclusion, let alone when you drag his firstborn into things. I mean, there's no way there's no cover-up SHT going on there." Shigaraki nodded on with feigned understanding, excited to see the same energy arise as when they first met over that All Might keychain, especially against heroes. "Don't get me wrong, I don't hate heroes, I mean, look at the pros like Eraserhead. He's awesome. But Endeavor doesn't even follow a heroic moral code. And yeah, maybe I'm a little biased looking between him and my fire-breathing but back home, but come on, he has more yearly casualties than over 4/5 of convicted murderers, and on top of that, he's constantly reported as rude and brushing off issues he sees as lower-rank issues. Seriously, you are a pro, what the F is a lower-rank issue? But no, the public can't find this out, so they keep all that info under NDAs and bribery." Izuku let out a huff and threw himself back against the booth, taking a solemn bite of his cake. "You do realize you just confessed to hacking the number 2 hero's medical records and finding information under NDAs, which last time I checked was pretty illegal too." Shigaraki taunted with a smirk as he sipped what Izuku had assumed was some sort of energy drink from his glass opposite him. You literally just asked me to check for you on the HPSC's wanted list. I think I'll live. Izuku sighed, still wallowing in his passion. Well, what would you have done if you found me on there? Shigaraki held a somewhat menacing demeanor, but Izuku had spent long enough reading people to notice the genuinely curious glint in his eye. I don't know, not much probably. Kinda defeats my whole vigilante goal to let you free if I do, but I'm too tired to care. Izuku stated bluntly, his filter between his brain and his mouth dropping ever so slightly. Vigilante. You wanna side with the heroes? Shigaraki looked at him warily, waiting for a response. No, not siding with the heroes, most of them are ignorant assholes considering hero worship got me here of all places, but underground heroes are decent. I mean, as long as they don't learn a couple particular details about me, I don't think they'd be too bad. You've got pros like Present Mike too, he has a couple charities, is a UA teacher and has a radio station. I rang in there a couple times as a kid, and he was like, really nice. I'm pretty sure I said something that concerned him on the phone one time, and he rang the number back after the show. Only reason he didn't do anything was because I brushed him off so I could put Mom's phone back without her noticing. Izuku seemed surrounded by memories, until his bubble suddenly broke and he looked Shigaraki dead in the eye with a smile so friendly he sounded insane. If I ran into All Might or Endeavor though, my first priority would be to punch them in the ball. Second priority would be running to the nearest alleyway they can't fit down. Shigaraki processed what he had to say, snorting slightly at the last statement, which seemed to be what pulled his mind onto Izuku's side. Alright, fair enough. At least you aren't siding with those two assholes. Shigaraki shrugged carelessly, before pulling up his buzzing phone. Oh, Sensei's messaged. I've gotta go. Shigaraki rose from his chair briskly. From what Izuku had gathered, this sensei is a complete and utter butt. Yes, he was using that word a lot today, yes it is justified. He did not plan on saying this to Shigaraki's face though, until his secret little background plan, save Shigaraki, fell into place. Okay, I'll message you soon. Izuku said with a smile, turning back to his laptop screen as Shigaraki wandered off with a nod and goodbye. Once he was alone, Izuku did something he'd been planning on doing for a while, join underground online forums. Yeah, he was in a couple, but he wasn't really active. It was just an information thing back when he skimmed them, but now he needed information and friends a little wider, even if it's just like-minded people. He scrolled through a couple before finding a quieter one, clicking it open and logging into his account, hastily changing the username from MightyBoy157 to Green Pebble, which was a bit of an on-the-spot pick but he'll live, before heading to the main chat and bracing himself. Ghostra 3M socks are okay to sleep in and I stand by that opinion. Drowsy_ please I need someone to side with me here. I can't cope with facing this insanity. Green Pebble ID help, but that would insinuate I change before sleeping. Drowsy_ what Green Pebble, it's all just power naps. My neck hates me. Ghostra 3M I can't tell if you are a common enemy or a middle ground. Green Pebble please don't be my enemy. I don't like confrontation. See Ghostra 3M wait no now I feel bad. Drow_E_ I think that's the point, Ghost. Green Pebble the meanness do not expose my tactics, they are all my trauma is good for Drowsy_mood. Ghostra 3M I can't cope with this, I'm going to sleep with my socks on. Green Pebble bye, smiley face. Drowsy_ hello new person, what brings you to the chat? Green Pebble, a love for underground pros and insomniacs. Drowsy_ which pros? Green Pebble this feels like an interrogation. I'm Eraserhead of Drowsy_ you are an Eraser fan. Green Pebble yeah. He's like my fave pro lol. Drowsy_ rare to find another member of my species priv chat. With that, Izuku found himself in an hour-long conversation about Eraserhead and quirk biases, of which Izuku was relatively sure they both shared an opinion on, until Shinso, as Izuku had been told his name was, had to do some homework before trying to sleep, reminding Izuku that he should probably head home as well. Chapter 12. Permanent borrowing and familiar faces. Izuku rose from the sofa awkwardly, his limbs contorted in ways that frankly shouldn't be possible as he held on to his faint post-nap recollection of even getting home. His current issue was, though, that he was hungry. This was an issue because Izuku has learned through trial and error not to trust his judgment when he's just woken up, especially in a kitchen. Which is exactly why he is now stood over the stove with a couple eggs frying in a pan. He had no idea how they never cracked in his bag, something he settled on being easier to make once he had already coated half the kitchen counter in flour he didn't even realize he had. That's not his problem, he can cope with that later. He still wasn't sure what he thought the flour was to begin with when he opened it anyway. Regardless, Izuku decided he had a very good idea. How high could he flip the eggs in the pan without it getting stuck to the ceiling? With this idea in mind, he gently raised the pan from the stove, building up his throw a couple of times before slamming his arms upwards and skittering around like a panicked fish whilst looking at the eggs above him before jerking his arm out suddenly, and like the amazing, wonderful, talented, organized genius he was, somehow catching them both in the pan. This had, however, resulted in one of the yolks popping open, splattering the pan in a gooey yellow. Oh well, it's still edible. Honestly, Izuku should get into knife throwing or something with his accuracy. Wait. He could do that. Jotting that down onto his mental list of goals, just underneath don't die and punch the top 2 heroes, he slid the surprisingly really good eggs onto a plate next to some toast he'd managed to prepare with minimal casualties, although there was a significant amount of jam on the tap now, whatever he had done to manage that. He wandered back over to the couch, plunking himself down before acknowledging his lack of utensils. Izuku decided he couldn't care enough to get them as he picked up one of the eggs not unlike one would pick up a taco shell and taking an unnecessarily large bite. Letting out an internal sigh of relief at the fact that he hadn't somehow charred the insides or something, Izuku began to think. He was planning on going out on another run today, and he honestly couldn't be bothered to redo his bandages, so that was his problem for some time in the general future, as everything seemed to be at the minute. It was probably okay to go running near that park again, so long as he didn't go in lest he risk facing that Yamada guy again. He probably wouldn't run that way anyway though. Seriously, who was he? Izuku drifted onto that train of thought as he crunched his way through his toast, careful to lean over the plate to catch the crumbs considering this sofa was looking more and more like his bed as the days went on. He isn't even sure if he's been in the bedroom yet to be honest. He can always do that later. Letting out a yawn despite having woken up maybe half an hour ago, setting him at around 10 a.m., he stood up and placed the plate into the sink, choosing to ignore the state of the kitchen. As he saw his bag on the counter, he chose to put it on. He was finally awake at a reasonable hour now, maybe he could go into a store or two for things he might need. Walking around to the door, Izuku slipped on his sneakers once again and made his way out of the apartment, heading downstairs and out of the main entrance before beginning a relatively quick run. His backpack, although pretty empty, slowed him down a bit, but Izuku figured he should start getting used to moving around with additional weight now rather than later, despite him proving his point to himself when he decided to lug half a DMN Beach's worth of metal home without wearing out. Izuku ended up pulling his hood over his head about midway through as the streets began to get more crowded, what with it being a fairly well-off area at peak times of the morning near a shopping mall. The things Izuku does to reach this vigilante thing. Eventually, he had to slow down to a normal walk, both due to his active overheating alongside the fact that he was basically boxed in with people as he approached the mall entrance. Bracing himself, Izuku pushed his way in, only to find it slightly calmer than the streets, with most people either being in shops or perched on benches and tables eating. Looking around, Izuku was flooded with memories of darting through here to the Hero merch store with Kaken, the route to the second floor, the sharp left turn, the third door to the left almost compelling his feet in that direction as he instead almost planted himself still looking around. He's not going to lie. There was a lot of people and if another kid started wailing Izuku thought he might end up strangling it. Despite this, he still darted into a fairly busy-looking clothing store, taking a quick breather as he looked around and decided that maybe God did appreciate him just a little bit. Near the back section, where a couple teens were already hovering, were various styles of fairly heavy-duty looking cargo trousers, with some harnesses next to it that informed him he'd ended up in some sort of wilderness travel store. Not that he was complaining, of course, as he walked over to the racks, pretending to absent-mindedly look over the various types of trousers with one hand while the other ferreted around in the rack, pulling out a couple pairs of trousers that Izuku was relatively sure had his size number on it. He leant so close to the stand he was barely noticeable as he shoved the cargoes under his plain hoodie he wore, holding a hand over his stomach to press the bump in his hoodie into something slightly more human, wandering past the harnesses and belts as he pulled a few off the shelves, barely looking at them. He was kind of wondering why no one was paying any attention to him until he saw the group of teens he'd seen just moments ago being hounded by security on the other side of the store. The world really did favor Izuku today, he thought as he dragged various items off of stands, not even looking at what was in his hands before darting through the door, which was just in homage to how highly this store seemed to think of itself since Izuku was pretty sure the security with those kids were their substitute for any security machines. Clinging to the wall as he left the store, Izuku tucked himself into an alcove between the bathrooms and some American-style chain diner that seemed pretty popular. Izuku rammed everything he'd grabbed in his bag, choosing to look at it when he got home as opposed to now, before glancing around and joining the general flow of people towards the exit to this sensory hell as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible, he had decided before he heard a familiar voice near enough booming over the crowds from nearby. "Come on, Sho, where are ya? I can't be that bad to shop the voice's whining was quickly cut off as Izuku felt himself collide with the man in question, the Yamada Hizashi he had gone out of his way to dodge. "Oh. It's you, kiddo." Yamada exclaimed, making a much more noticeable effort at keeping calm now than last time. It kind of felt like he'd read one of those parenting for dummies guides and taken it to an extreme. "Sorry about last time, I must have startled you, huh?" Yamada scratched the back of his head through his somehow not tangled hair in an attempted display at something between embarrassment and an apology. "It's all fine, I'm not startled." Izuku's voice wobbled out, in a way that definitely made him sound startled as he took his turn to scratch his hair, albeit he ran his fingers along the side of his head, not quite ready to face whatever sleep did to the back of his hair. "Well, my apologies anyway. How are you? You seemed injured the last time I saw you." Yamada took a moment to settle on his choice of words, although this still had Izuku freezing up in a panic regardless. "I'm okay, I'm not injured." At this point Izuku felt more like he was chanting affirmations than answering questions, but he was much too overstimulated to really process much of what was going on. "That's good to hear." It was obvious in his voice that Yamada didn't believe him. Not that Izuku expected him to, of course. "I'm out shopping with my husband at the minute, but he's gone and ran off. Always grumbling about me being a too enthusiastic shopper." Yamada grumbled out, exaggerating air quotes as he spoke grumpily, although his demeanor quickly progressed to suppressed excitement as he managed to pull a snort from Izuku. "You should probably go find him then." Izuku settled on, still glancing occasionally towards the exit. "You're right, kiddo, I bet he's hidden in that cat cafe." Yamada squinted his eyes behind a pair of black-rimmed glasses up at where the cat cafe was, hidden in a slightly quieter area of the mall. "Good luck, bye Yamada sir." "Bye." Izuku left no time for a response as he merged quickly with the crowd, barely taking in the surprised look on Yamada's face as he left. "There you are," Hizashi announced, walking over to Shoyuta, who merely let out a sigh, showing minimal discontent whilst he had a cat or two nestled in his scarf. "You know what, I'll be angry at you later. Guess who I ran into?" Hizashi took the seat opposite Shoyuta with a quiet thud, taking his raised eyebrow as prompting enough to talk, "The green kid, the one I saw in the park." At this, both of Shuta's eyebrows were raised as he took a sip of whatever frighteningly sweet coffee concoction was sat in front of him. How was he? Panicked, again. Denied being injured, laughed at a joke I made though. Hizashi began to ramble a bit, an old little habit of his he'd never been able to shake when he was worried about something. He didn't look too good, to be honest. Hizashi rested his elbows on the table, his hair was like yours back in our UA days and he had bandages up his arms when I saw him rub his hair, so he definitely was injured. I wouldn't be too confident in saying he's eating well either. Not to say he looked skin and bones, at least from what I could see behind that hoodie of his, but if he didn't have some range of deficiencies then my life might as well be a lie. Well, that's not all bad. Shoyuta mumbled, taking in Hisashi's gawking expression of disbelief before continuing, I mean, you know whatever injuries he had didn't kill him, and that he probably lives in the area. Could also argue he's alone too, based on how you're describing him. If not alone, he didn't need to finish the sentence, Hisashi having already filled in the blanks, something which didn't do much to calm his proactiveness to the adorable child he'd seen. All Hisashi really wanted to do right now was track the child down, fight his hair with some of the products he'd forced Shoyuta into using to tame his hair a bit, wrap him up in a blanket or two and feed him ridiculously unhealthy food. As the house chef, Shoyuta wasn't allowed near any appliance but the coffee machine after he managed to fry a hole through a pan on a turned-off stove, and watch some of the old superhero movies he loved. Hisashi would do that, he decided with a resolute determination in his eye that he only knew was there based on Shuta's expression of slight worry, this determination only ever resulting in chaos and sometimes a cat as bribe for him. Would Izuku count as a cat? He was small, cute and his hair looked fluffy enough. Hisashi could also see him with the feisty determination of a cat. Following that thought, he ended up giving in to Shoyuta and ordering a drink of his own for a quick break. Chapter 13, Izuku's Badass, Accidental, debut. Izuku led strewn over his sofa, his heart feeling ready to burst from his chest as he still clutched his bag to himself. He'd checked through the bag, finding a variety of clothing items but also a few more random items that he dragged off of shelves. He was most impressed with the flashlight out of that, but when he saw the travel container of seasonings, he realized he now had a very good defense against vision-based quirks, which is always good. Now, however, he was practically about to start counting sheep if it meant letting the sleep that hung over him in such a taunting manner claim him. In his half-asleep state, he began reminiscing on past memories. He thought back to the days before his diagnosis, the ones that were more emotion than memory, all the way through to his last day with the rest of the world. He didn't quite feel ready yet to ponder on his time here, that would probably make this all seem a bit more real, and once that happened, Izuku didn't think he'd be able to cope with it. Note to self, do not fall asleep to memories about your past and not expect to have a nightmare about it. Looking up at the clock in the dim light he always left on in the kitchen, Izuku didn't know if he'd ever be able to shake his fear of the dark. It always led him back to that second-floor janitor's closet at Aldera. He read the time. 2 a.m., great. Well, not like he's going to be getting back to sleep anytime soon. Izuku sat pondering on things to do. First off, he could change these bandages, he still needed to apply some more burn cream to his shoulders, and then he could think about something to fill the time. Wandering off to the bathroom, of which he had finally reorganized alongside the kitchen upon returning home, he reached into the cabinet under the sink, pulling out his trusty first aid kit and getting to work, slowly tearing off the bandages along his arms, shoulders and neck. He'd given up on bandaging his legs a long while ago. They weren't burned too badly and he was never any good at wrapping bandages on his legs without them falling off. He took out some burn cream, slathering it without really looking over his calves as he leant over to get a look at his shoulder. It wasn't as aggressive as it had been, but it still had that mildly concerning sheen to it that Izuku didn't quite trust as he disinfected the burn with a couple pained hisses before applying the burn cream there. Once he'd finished with that, he got on to bandaging his neck, which he'd started doing first in order to stop the rest of his bandages loosening as he attempted to put them on. With a couple difficult angles, and a little less of the real gone than last time, he took to securing bandages around his arms. The burns and scrapes there weren't too bad, apart from his elbows and his wrists where he'd been trying to grab Kaken, but the uniform cuts over top of them probably wouldn't take kindly to anything too strenuous. Which is exactly why he decided on going out for a walk at 2 a.m. in his fairly dangerous neighborhood. Walking out of the bathroom, Izuku threw on a thermal-lined hoodie from his little haul, a new shirt from his couple amazingly funny shirts that he had lying around, alongside his mask creation over a plain black mask so as not to scratch his skin. Hey, it's in its early stages. Shoving the travel pepper in his pocket just in case, Izuku grabbed his phone and slid out the door. The hallways were unsurprisingly more active now, with shady figures sliding in between rooms and buildings, a couple here and there with a woman walking with them, batting her eyelashes as they made hushed conversation. Izuku chose not to question that as he opted for the stairs, not really wanting to face anything like that in the elevator. Hitting the bottom floor after what felt like way too long, Izuku strode out of the building, hands in his pockets and glancing around occasionally under his hood. The being on edge side of things brought him a bit of comfort, actually. It reminded him of how he would stay alert walking home from school. If he shut his eyes, he might have even been able to pretend that he was slinking home through alleyways. Not that he would shut his eyes though, that didn't sound like a good idea wandering around here. These thoughts all came to a halt, however, when he heard a feminine scream echo from an alley nearby. Well, he was dressed up for the occasion. His mind was already made as he silently darted across what turned out to be a block of buildings, before sliding to a stop at the entry of an alley. He couldn't really tell what was going on in the lighting, all he could see was a woman frozen solid, a bluish aura surrounding her as a tall, slender figure with glowing blue eyes stood in front of her with a smirk, and a short boy with unique purple hair, if you could even call those ball hair, was perched behind her with what was definitely an angle under her skirt. That settled things for Izuku then, he decided as he stepped a little further into the alleyway until he was about a couple meters away, pulling open the pepper in his front pocket, loading both of his hands with it. What an interesting situation we have here. Izuku watched the boys freeze, the blue-eyed boy keeping his eyes on the woman but the short boy turning to Izuku with a quivering lip. The mask seems to have both muffled and distorted Izuku's voice a bit to have a slight echo to it. Nice. What are you doing here? Who are you? Where did you come from? The purple boy stuttered out, pointing an accusatory finger at Izuku. Izuku really couldn't help messing with them if they deserved it now. Me. Oh, I've been here all this time. What? Child, I am always watching. Now, surrender or face your repentance by force. The boy quivered for a second, before reaching towards his hair, which Izuku took as his cue to launch a handful of pepper in each person's direction. The plumes of pepper quickly merged, alongside a loud stumble and the sound of something stumbling towards Izuku, although by the clacking of heels, the noise brought Izuku a bit of relief after the woman near enough collapsed to the floor behind him. The cloud eventually cleared, revealing the tall boy clutching at his eyes, and the short one in a tense panic, throwing a ball which he seemed to have got from his hair at Izuku, the ball promptly rolling down his side where it was aimed and to the floor, leaving the boy with an expression of disarray. But, how, it didn't stick. Oh, that's what they did. Well, the boy would probably find a different response if he tried throwing another ball, although he seemed too surprised that the ball which was completely covered in pepper didn't stick to Izuku to try and throw one with little enough pepper to still be sticky. Whatever, gives Izuku more room to scare them. Darting into the shadows of the alleyway, Izuku first whacked the taller boy over the head with his pepper container, the figure barely realizing what had happened before hitting the ground, still nurturing his eyes. He then picked up the boy, holding his arms to his sides with his hands, and turning the boy to face him. I am inevitable. Seek only mercy. Is all Izuku whispered through the distorted echo before reaching to pinch the back of his neck, something he'd done to one too many older brothers who thought he'd be fun to follow. Allowing the boy to fall limp to the ground. Then, he acknowledged the whimpering behind him to see the woman still perched at the end of the alley. He slowly approached her, before crouching down in front of her, keeping an eye on the pepper-coated villains to their side before making an attempt at seeming comforting. Are you all right, ma'am? Izuku asked, head tilted. He did not expect to be thrown into a sniveling hug, brown hair filling his nose, or mask, as he stumbled back to be seated on the ground, but here he was. Izuku could make out flurried streams of thank yous and things of a similar variety before the woman pulled back with an embarrassed expression. He then realized the rip going up the top of her dress, making an effort to keep his eyes on her face. Thank you so much, you really are my hero. She cried out, what can I do to repay you? Do you have a name? SHT Izuku did not think ahead enough to have a name. Come on, he's got to have a nickname or something he could use. I don't want any repayment, ma'am, but if you want a name, please, call me Crow. Once he'd given her a smile he'd hoped had translated okay, it seemed she'd noticed the rip in her shirt, and was now looking around even more embarrassed, albeit now much more panicked. At this, Izuku, like the people-pleaser he is, moved off to the side of his vision before engaging in an awkward dance with his hoodie in order to get his shirt off from underneath. Once his hoodie was sort of in place, he offered the shirt out to her, glad that he'd decided to change it when he got left, but wishing he did not put on a shirt that merely said "Sheets" across the front in black lettering. Sorry, my fashion sense isn't amazing, but you can put this on if you'd like. I'd advise you to call the police now. I'm happy to stay with you until they come. Wow, Izuku was a natural. The girl hesitated for a moment before reaching out a shaky hand and taking the shirt, sliding it on as she pulled her phone out of a pocket Izuku didn't even realize was there. He hovered ominously over the perverts as she stuttered down the line, wary of them waking up. Once he'd heard the click of her nails against the phone again, he looked back up, catching her grateful eye as she attempted to catch her breath. They stood in that silence for a while, until the faint sound of sirens emerged nearby, and Izuku quickly made his absolutely badass exit into the shadows, completely unaware of the patchwork man watching him from the alley he was backing into. Chapter 14, The Izuku's Pseudo-Family Plague Spreads. Shoyuta had no idea why he thought it was a good idea to stop any longer than he needed to. Actually, that's a lie. He stopped because he swears they put the coffee machine by the holding cells for criminals just to spite him. Whatever the reason, it was not a good enough one to warrant being spotted by Naomasa, especially as he was walking around with that telltale look in his eye that made it clear he was looking for someone to do something. Those eyes quickly fell on Shoyuta, despite his attempts at hiding behind the coffee machine, fresh cup in hand. Ah, Eraserhead, perfect timing. I know you don't like taking calls since they impede on your patrol, but we are really understaffed tonight, and I think this one might interest you. Naomasa had a tone that sounded far too much like a salesman by the end of that, and as much as Shoyuta didn't like it, he felt the need to prod. And why would I want to go on this one? You'd need to put me in the van with someone to drive anyway, looking at my track record in those things. Shoyuta said with his normal monotonous voice, downing about half the coffee in his hand to instead express his displeasure. Well, the caller, a woman, was a victim of an attack. Why did he think this would pique Shuta's interest in any way positive? And yet, her attackers were knocked out before they could get too far. By a new face, who asked to be called Crow. There it was. Let it be known that Aizawa Shoyuta did not have a soft spot for youths, nor was the few vigilantes he'd worked with in his time his children, as Namiri was prone to suggesting. He just liked to make sure they were okay. Before he knew it, he was in the passenger seat of a messy police van, the crackling of the police radio channel occasionally perking up through the speakers as he glanced around at the rain pattering against the windows of the vehicle, and then to the officer next to him. From what he'd heard, she was pretty nice. Probably why they put her with him. He wasn't exactly known for being a friendly face. He decided he liked her though when she turned on the sirens as they went. As much as he hated the sirens, they were a pretty good hide signal for the vigilantes he was generally cleaning up after, and she seemed to know that too. He knew they had a car coming behind them soon for the victim, although who knows what timing was looking like for that. Eventually, she bumped up onto a curb in one of the worst areas in Mizutofu, which was exactly why he mainly patrolled that area. Sliding out of the vehicle, he quickly darted to the alley to take in the scene. The officer just beside him heading towards a girl sat with her back to one of the brick walls, a shirt reading, sheets. Covering most of her upper arms to what was probably somewhere mid-thigh if she were to be stood up. She was mostly under a portion of roof that bridged into the alleyway, which was good in the wake of the pattering rain. Regardless, the victim wasn't his job right now. Looking at the two unconscious boys on the floor, he took in the way that one had his hands just by his eyes, which looked to have been pretty scrubbed, as well as the ball that made up the other kid's hair matching one rolled against the wall of the alley. He could also see some sort of substance on the floor. It looked a blackish brown, although he couldn't really make out what it was due to the rainwater now washing it away. Shoyuta walked forward towards the boys, wrapping them both up tightly in his capture scarf before tying said scarf to a street lamp just next to where the officer was now talking to the girl. He quickly approached the duo, trying his best to seem somewhat less intimidating than usual. He went to ask what was going on, but ended up not needing to as the officer turned to him. "Hey, Eraserhead. Can I have your opinion on this quick?" "Sure, what is it?" The officer smiled encouragingly to the girl as she shakily turned to face Shoyuta. "Well, I was just talking about Crow's quirk. He seemed to merge with the shadows. I mean, when he knocked out that tall guy I didn't even see him do it. He just looked like he was stood holding that grape boy the entire time." She took a couple breaths in an attempt to calm her panic, and then that gas. "When he first appeared, he did it when I was frozen. All I saw was him raise his hands and then all of a sudden there was the black smoke stuff flying towards those two." She gestured towards the two still unconscious boys tied to the lamp post, and when he spoke, he said stuff about repenting, and that he was always there and watching, and that he was inevitable and just all stuff like that. But then once the battle was over it was like you flipped a switch. He was so nice to me. He even gave me his shirt since my dress was ripped." Shoyuta was honestly content to let her talk, since it seemed to be doing as much good helping her process it as it was doing them good at potentially identifying this kid. "Through his quirk. Could have been some sort of shadow quirk or something to do with turning himself into smoke. Although that wouldn't explain why there's still the substance on the floor." "How old do you think he was?" "It might help us narrow it down a bit." Shoyuta was never good at guessing quirks he hadn't seen. He mainly focused on quirk types, so he figured he might as well get whatever information he could. "I don't know. He knew what he was doing but he wasn't old, you know." No, Shoyuta didn't know, like, I would pin him mid-20s at the oldest. She settled on. Okay, that made more sense. Shoyuta hoped that he was that old. He didn't know if he could cope with watching another kid getting injured or arrested trying to be a hero. He found himself forming a mental profile of this kid as he saw the police car pull up, another officer stepping out to trade vehicles with the female officer. Izuku froze as he heard a slow clap come from the mouth of the alleyway he was about to emerge from. He looked up to face a tall man, with hair similar to Kaken's, albeit the man's was black, as well as an excessively long trenchcoat, and, more identifiably, strips of purple skin stapled over at least half of his visible body. For a kid who just took out two pervs with such elegance, you sure do lack spatial awareness, huh? A dry voice emerged from the man with a huff of a laugh, a smirk encompassing his lips as he spoke. For a guy who's wandering around one of the most dangerous areas of Mizutofu, you sure do leave your PP open to blunt force attacks. Izuku deadpanned back, hands tensed into fists in his pockets as he stared up at the man, who, to Izuku's surprise, started to laugh. A genuine laugh. "Oh, shoot me for trying to see what the new hero wannabe is up to dressing in shirts like the one you offered up. Hero wannabe insinuates that there isn't an active list of pro-heroes I would attack on sight if I saw them." Izuku maintained his prior tone, before switching to something a tad more playful, "And as far as shirts go, you're hardly a walking model." "Touché." The figure raised his hands in defeat. "Is this list open to the public?" "That really depends on your opinion on Endeavor. And All Might. Depends how far down the list you think you'll get." The man's demeanor immediately shifted to something more reminiscent, although he seemed almost excited at the mention of Endeavor ranking on such an aggressive scale. An Endeavor hater. Not often you find someone who says things like that with passion behind it. "Do you want the truth, or a sugar-coated lie?" Izuku asked, leaning against a wall of the alley in a position mirroring the man's. "I'm sorry. Do you want the reasoning behind why I think Endeavor is a flaming beach, or do you want a societally acceptable lie?" The man froze for a second with raised eyebrows before his smirk returned, wider. "I'll take the first option." "Good. First and foremost, I've hacked into his legal records, and do you know how many times people have attempted to take this man to court? Over 150 times a year. How does one F up people's lives enough for that, and how the F do you ethically silence them all? Answer: you can't. Second of all, I've taken a look at his family records, and I don't even want to dive into that right now because I don't yet have any help for my next prank attack set up and will feel compelled to do it alone. Following that, his casualty rate. I've seen less deaths in DMN wars. The statistics are vile once you get past the fluffy vague ones on his official website. Also, pranking him makes for a very good stress reliever because of his anger issues, which are a whole other problem in and of themselves. Izuku paused for a breath, taking in the man opposite him, who looked a combination of startled and excited, with a hint of something else, something that might almost have been a bit more caring as he looked at Izuku. I can get behind that. Although, if you want to get a real blow on Endeavor, you'll need at least some idea on real hand-to-hand. I saw the way you avoided combat back there. Izuku's gaze immediately became a bit more sheepish. Well, I didn't exactly have anyone to teach me. Izuku mumbled under his breath, although the man seemed to have managed to make it out through the mask's echo. After a contemplative pause from the man, he grabbed Izuku's hand, causing him to freeze up near immediately, before pulling a half-dead pen out of his pocket and scrawling in what looked like an attempt at rebelling against neat fonts what could have been the word Dabi and a phone number. I can teach you a thing or two, just don't go blowing up my DMN phone, got it kid? Dabi announced before turning and walking deeper into the alleyway. Chapter 15, Living, Ghosts of the Past. Izuku took the fast route home, deciding that the walk had definitely tired him out enough as anticipated. As soon as he got through the door, he threw his mask and hoodie off, resecuring some of his bandages, before giving up on trying to get his hoodie back on and falling asleep with it draped over him akin to a blanket, once again on the sofa. Groggily sitting up, Izuku took in the clock reading 10 a.m. on the wall opposite him. Stretching himself awake, Izuku quickly wrapped himself up in his hoodie, stumbling over to the kitchen. He rummaged through the cabinets, searching for something to eat, before finally settling on a couple granola bars from inside a box of them that he didn't even realize he had. They were peanut-flavored, a safe enough option, Izuku supposed, although he wouldn't call it his favorite as he quickly ate them. Speaking of eating, he should probably go out and buy some fresh food. Half a granola bar in his mouth, Izuku rummaged through his yellow bag, checking it was completely empty of his loot, as Shigaraki would describe it, from the day before. He then placed some of the cash back at the bottom of the bag. Izuku honestly didn't really care about taking clothes and whatnot, but he figured he'd at least want to keep frequenting the grocery store. This, however, meant he could play one of his favorite games, Fake a Quirk. Usually he didn't last long, someone who knew him would always come along screaming from the rooftops, but now he had all the time in the world. Izuku stepped out onto the street with a smile, something mildly unbefitting for the location. He took brisk strides towards the direction of the mall, although turned off to the right early, heading now in the direction of that beach. He thought he'd walked past a store on his way back, so he might as well go in there, less chance of word spreading about his condition then. Turning into the car park, Izuku didn't even bother grabbing a cart, he might as well carry it all, he didn't need much after all. The store wasn't too busy, with only one tired cashier on the register and a couple regulars, most relatively old, wandering around the store. Firstly, he needed some sort of meat. He was no expert, but he knew that was a pretty staple part of a diet, as he picked up a couple different meats he'd have to identify once he was home. And vegetables too. He needed those too. Walking over to the fresh produce aisle, Izuku grabbed a variety of vegetables, and probably a mix of fruits too, before turning to check down the rest of the aisles for anything he may need. He froze in his tracks, though, when he heard the familiar sound of teenage laughter. Glancing slowly down the aisle to his left, he was just about to pass, he took in the group of boys shoving various items into their pockets as they shoved each other around. There was 3 of them. 2 of them in Aldera uniforms, and one who wasn't, but he still recognized the boy. He was one of Kaken's followers who had gotten expelled a couple weeks before Izuku made his exit. Which meant the 3, or maybe just 2, of them were skipping school. Which meant they would also definitely confront Izuku if they spotted him. Hisashi trundled around the quiet store with a small smile, pausing with frequency to place a few things in the cart. As much as the store was one of the quieter ones in the area, that being a big reason why they shopped there, he didn't want to force Shoyuta to endure his apparent shopping wrath, especially after the night cooped up in the station he described. Although, that vigilante sounded interesting. Hell, with a quirk like what had been described, he wondered why they weren't a pro, or at least somewhere near. At least it managed to bring a smile to his show's face as he explained the pervert's reactions in regards to the vigilante once they'd woken up. Hizashi ordinarily would have called Shoyuta cruel for finding someone's panic funny, but he felt that the two deserved it enough for it to be okay, he thought as he placed a head of broccoli into his cart, glancing up to be shocked out of his thoughts by a familiar wash of green hair in front of him. Hizashi slowly made his way in that direction, pausing at the end of the aisle to pick up some bananas. He was honestly glad he didn't radio in the mornings now that he could check on the kid. His excitement was soon snatched away, however, as he watched the kid freeze, his hands beginning to tremble as he glanced down a nearby aisle. Hizashi could just about make out a couple of middle school kids down there before the kiddo had already practically disappeared with a fearful gasp, giving Hizashi time to only see his dreadful expression. Wait a minute. Now that Hizashi thought about it, that was the second time in the past few days that he's seen the kid during school hours. But why did he freak out looking at those middle schoolers? And why was the kid even buying groceries in the first place? Hizashi made sure Shoyuta was the first to hear of his flurry of questions as soon as he'd managed to collapse in the armchair opposite where his show was stretched out, resting his eyes as he'd say on the sofa. He could have been bullied. I was scared of my middle school classmates. Shoyuta suggested, running his hand through his hair with a yawn. Of course. Why didn't Hizashi think of that? Not that he wanted that to be true or anything. Now he wished he realized that at the store when the students were there. Hizashi may not like hurting children, but he was fond enough of the kiddo that he'd make an exception. Chapter 16, Making Plans and Revelations Alike. Izuku sat in a crumpled heap, back leant against the sofa, a foot, still in his shoe, pressed up against a large chunk of metal in one of the various piles around the room. His breathing was fast and shallow, his fingertips feeling prickly as they scratched against the skin of his upper arms, clenching around his stomach in a knee-jerk reaction to protect himself once he'd stumbled into his apartment, his panicked cries slowly subsiding as the adrenaline slowly faded from his system, instead making him aware of the throbbing soreness in his legs from the sprint home, alongside the awful, sticky texture of the BLD along his fingertips, and the way his back was definitely going to hurt once he tried to move out of the position he was in. Honestly, he didn't even realize that his new apartment was anywhere near Aldera, although now that he thinks about it, that checks out, it was only a few-minute walk from school to the mall. He'd never made the walk himself, but he'd heard plenty of the girls in his class discussing it, especially considering some of the clothing stores that had opened up there recently. Izuku never really paid attention when they were discussing it, merely relieved that he wouldn't have to worry about all of his class on his trek home, but now he was really wishing he did. Well, hindsight is 20/20 and Izuku really needed to find something to do before he scared himself out of his own mind anymore. Pulling his hands from the half-dried BLD caking two reasonably sized patches of his arms that his nails had been raking against prior, Izuku looked his hands up and down, before his eye caught on something, a phone number. Dabi's phone number. Looks like Izuku had plans now. He quickly straightened his back, groaning at the feeling before moving to flop onto the couch, after dumping his hoodie that he dragged off the moment he got in through the door under his back, just where his arms would lay. Me hello, laughing face, it's me from the other day, the really cool guy in the alley, crowed Dabi. Oh hello, I thought you'd gone and died or something when you didn't message last night. NGL me trust, I feel like I'm dying. Dabi, well that's not good me no. But I'd like to take you up on that training offer. 3 Dabi, after your last sentence I feel like I should say no, but I don't trust you not to do anything stupid instead. F it, when are you free? And thus, Izuku now had evening plans. Now the only plan is to stay cool, calm and collected whilst he waited. Within 5 minutes Izuku found himself hacking into a government website out of fear that they'd caught a photo of him removing any of his crow disguise that he took off in his most likely secure apartment that he had never even opened the curtains of. It took a bit of digging, but after aiming for Muzutafu police specifically, he found a small file on himself. Yay. Reading through it, Izuku sniggered to himself slightly. Izuku could act maybe. Probably not. He could, however, fake a death, darkness, smoke, and everything else the police had seemed to pick up from his theatrics, quirk. He was actually very good at faking quirks. One time he even had a cashier convinced he could enlarge his hands. Well, yeah, it was kinda mean taking advantage of the depth perception of the guy's animal quirk, but it meant Izuku could buy what he needed, so he thought he'd live. Speaking of quirks, who had they assigned to his case by now? Normally they'd assign at least one pro to a case like this, just to say they are dealing with it. It's normally a small timer if they don't think the person is going to be a concert Eraserhead. They had the pro hero Eraserhead on his case. Now there were a few pros and cons here. Eraserhead was easily Izuku's favorite pro, meaning he would either somehow double his effort to get away, or his stutter would come back to haunt him. His little pepper trick would work wonders in the situation that Eraserhead was trying to arrest him. Eraserhead was definitely trying to arrest him. Eraserhead doesn't like being assigned to empty cases. It literally says so in the man's police file. He'd have to be careful about when he did certain things. If Eraserhead was canceling his quirk and he merged with the shadows, as the file worded it, that would hardly be anything good for Izuku. Ooh, maybe he could fake some mutant-type aspects to the quirk. Izuku felt himself buzzing with ideas as he left the bathroom, having rewrapped his bandages to reach higher up his arms. He'd need to get more bandages soon. He found a couple travel first aid kits in his little haul, but he'd prefer to keep those for his vigilante work. He sat himself back down on the sofa after having retrieved an apple he must have grabbed yesterday when trying to shop, taking a large bite, getting the apple chunk stuck at the front of his mouth, dislodging it, forcing some pieces of apple skin out from between his teeth and throwing himself back onto the sofa with his laptop. God, fruits were overrated. Flicking through his laptop programs aimlessly, he suddenly received a notification. Drowsy _ as a fellow Eraser fan I feel compelled to share this, but whispers around the police station is that he was there last night for multiple hours to interrogate a couple criminals and a victim. Apparently he was fishing for information about some new vigilante kid. Green Pebble. Really? Surprised face, how'd you even find this out? Drowsy _ Eve got an uncle who works at the police station. Eraserhead is in there pretty often talking to their lead detective apparently but it gets me more Eraserhead info so I don't question it. Green Pebble. Why do you think Eraser was looking for the vigilante? If he's that new surely they have bigger problems. No. Drowsy _ oh they do have bigger problems. Eraser ends up on a lot of vigilante cases. Apparently he gets pretty determined though from what my uncle has said, like he won't leave them alone for very long without a conversation. Not the kinda guy to just go straight in for the arrest though, which I respect. Green Pebble. Dang, should I be keeping an eye out for this vigilante? Well, if I see a new face on an evening walk you'll know who it is. LOL. Izuku closed the chat, leaned back on the sofa. Well, that gave him a lot to think about. At least Eraserhead wasn't an immediate threat. That meant he had time to figure out some strategies. He felt sleep overtake him to that thought as he set an alarm for a little before he needed to meet Dabi and taking a peaceful afternoon nap. Chapter 17, Training with Bribery. Izuku shot awake to the sound of his alarm, attempting to orient himself to his surroundings as he blinked owlishly at the number 1116 staring back at him on his phone. After about a minute of trying to figure out why the F he'd decided to torture himself with an alarm near enough midnight, he remembered his conversation with Dabi, flying up from the sofa to throw on something that relatively fitted the vibe he wanted of Crow. An internal debate led him to procrastinating changing his bandages again just a little longer. They'd probably get messed up trying to figure out how to throw a punch anyway, so there wasn't much point attempting to change them, he decided as he threw on a shirt labeled flannel shirt and layered a new, black hoodie over top it, choosing not to change his undershirt for now. He figured all black clothing would fit with the Crow theme, so he threw on a pair of black cargo trousers he'd grabbed at the mall, using a belt with a couple pouches attached and whatnot to secure the trousers in place, before opening his phone again to check the address from Dabi's messages. It was a warehouse about 15 minutes from where Izuku was staying, but knowing Izuku's luck that would either be a 7-minute journey or a 30-minute one. From what Izuku could find online, the cluster of warehouses it was in were unused, which meant the only people that would be around were people living in them. That was only if Dabi wasn't actually some secret kidnapper or something. But Izuku doubted it. If he was a kidnapper, surely he'd make enough money to change that shirt that was older than Izuku. With his resolve solidified and his metal mask situation slid on, he made his way out of the front door, slipping a key into his pocket on the way, doing an even better job at ignoring the variety of situations around him this night than the one before. Tonight, Izuku decided to take his time merely surveying the area, simply keeping an eye out along the alleyways and streets as he followed the directions lined up on his phone. Not many people were about, although the area he was relatively confident he was heading into was filled more with addicts and the like than any more serious crimes. Despite this, Izuku still kept his head on a swivel, keeping an eye out for any semblance of danger as he walked into the collection of warehouses, scanning the numbers spray painted atop the doors until, after much longer than it probably should have taken, Izuku finally located warehouse. Now suddenly a lot more cautious than he had been just moments prior, Izuku gently slid the door open, checking the time that read 11:57 on his phone before dropping it into a pocket and stepping into the warehouse. Well, of all the things I expected of you, I gotta say that time management skills weren't exactly up there. Dabi's dry voice announced, bringing Izuku's attention to the man who was sat on a chair in what looked like a makeshift hybrid between a workout area and a hangout spot. Dabi seemed to notice Izuku's glances across the room as he spoke again. This place is shared by me and a few other people, although it isn't really put to much use during the week. Izuku let out a noise of response, wandering towards Dabi. So I'm assuming that showing up here wasn't a death wish, considering the significant lack of a weapon. Izuku settled on saying, lowering himself in a chair near to Dabi. Nah, not death so much as getting your butt kicked. I doubt you'll be any good. Dabi chuckled under his breath. Excuse you, you wouldn't even be able to lay a hand on me. Izuku snorted indignantly, arms crossed as he spoke. You keep telling yourself that. Dabi's nose crinkled up as he laughed, drawing Izuku's attention to something he hadn't noticed before. Wait, do you have nose piercings? Izuku asked, taking on a posture akin to an aggravated goose trying to stretch to get a better look at them. Ha! Oh, yeah, myself. Dabi said with a prideful smirk, tilting his head slightly so Izuku could see them properly. You can do piercings. Izuku exclaimed with a mix of excitement and curiosity, practically vibrating in his seat. Truth be told, Izuku had always thought piercings looked super badass, although if he showed up to Aldera with a piercing, someone probably would have ended up ripping it out of his skin. I learned how to do piercings and tattoos back when I was just some angsty teenager, pretty good at them too. You can do tattoos too. Izuku looked to be feeling even more awestruck by the minute. I always wanted that stuff, but I've never been able to get it. After a moment of contemplation, Dabi spoke again. F it, if you do half decent in training today, I'll give you a piercing or some SHT. I'd have to check your anatomy and all that, but hey, whatever motivates. Dabi pushed himself up from his chair with a groan, Izuku now completely ecstatic as he almost bounced up and down, making absolutely no effort to hide behind Crow's 20-year-old veil. Calm down, kid, you gotta be able to focus. There wasn't any heat behind the words, although Izuku soon obediently stood in front of him, a prepared smile on his face. Dabi knew Crow wasn't just some normal vigilante once he'd first stumbled across him, although he'd quickly made a couple more revelations once he'd shown up to train. First and foremost, Crow was AF child. There was no way he was older than 15, which made Dabi all the more glad he'd picked this one of all kids to find. Secondly, Crow had to have been both abused and injured. The kid would flinch before Dabi would even think about moving, and as much as Crow probably didn't realize he was doing it, he seemed to be going out of his way to keep any strain off of a pretty major part of his arm. This was why Dabi chose to demonstrate on the air as he replicated the punches he remembered having drilled into him from such a young age, even after all these years. It felt wrong to repeat the motions, to move Crow's arms ever so slightly as his stance wavered, although the knowledge that, if they ever ended up meeting, the kid would use his old man's punches to aim for the very weakness that Flaming Butt taught him on the man's own body pushed him through it. After what felt like an eternity of punching, holding his stance, and some kicking too, although Crow ate up anything he had to say in that time, Dobby finally decided to call it a night. Or day. He honestly wasn't sure what the time was at this point. Despite this, he still wasn't able to leave without Crow bringing those piercings back up, and as much as Dobby knew he should probably be responsible or something, he was a bad influence older brother at heart, and realistically, not even the devil could deny the pleading eyes Crow sent his way as he spoke. With an exhausted sigh and even more new plans, Dobby shuffled a couple things back into place before flicking the warehouse's temperamental light back off and shuffling out. Chapter 18, A Trip and a Half Home. Izuku was so excited he felt like he could run a marathon. Not that he would, of course, he's got other dumb SHT to get up to. But as he wandered back, mask in his pocket since he forgot to put it back on after training, and the hood of his hoodie making half an attempt at covering his hair, he began to retrace the evening over in his head. So, he now knew how to throw a punch and not break his knee or dislocate his ankle when kicking, which, according to a very exasperated-looking Dobby, was a genuine possibility with the way Izuku was doing it. That was positive. What was even better, however, was the fact that Dobby had actually agreed to pierce Izuku. Sure, there was probably some sort of law around that Izuku should be paying more attention to, but come on, his sketchy bad influence trainer friend guy, yeah, Izuku really needs to work on that one, was okay with doing it, so Izuku kind of didn't care. He was shaken out of these blissful thoughts, though, when he felt a sense of unease begin to rise in his gut. He felt like he was being watched. Now, not to brag or anything, but Izuku was an absolute expert at being able to tell when he's being watched or tailed, and, judging by the way just about every instinct he had was blaring alarm bells louder than his own internal monologue, he was definitely being followed. With a sigh of defeat, Izuku took a sharp right turn, and darted into an alleyway beside him, currently somewhat grateful for the bullies that tailed him home as he recognized the near silent, but abrupt sound, of someone making a sudden change in direction. As he heard it though, Izuku found himself confused, weaving through the surprisingly quiet maze of alleys. The noise sounded as if it had come from above him, something that would make it much more difficult to make a clean escape than he'd like. This person may be good, but Izuku was willing to bet his chances that they'd never been against someone with his on-the-spot analysis skills. Riding on that knowledge, Izuku took another turn, this time to the left where he was relatively confident the person was, pressing himself against the wall in order to hide under the building's overhang, scooping up a handful of gravel in the process before launching that handful down the alley he was in before he turned, and braced for the worst. Luckily for Izuku, he quickly felt that presence leave him be, and, after longer than Izuku was willing to admit, he pulled himself from the wall he was almost willing to cement himself to if it meant hiding and renavigating his way out of the alleys, a lot more aware than he had been prior. Shoyuta thought this could have been the most boring patrol he's ever been on. That's not a complaint, of course, but not even Mrs. Itami's cat came out to visit him, which meant the old woman had probably let Machi back onto the bed again. As much as Hizashi's socialness around the neighborhood bewildered him, he might love the pet updates he gets from them. The night's silence may have been the reason he noticed the kid walking along the street as quickly as he did. At a first glance, Shoyuta thought the kid might have been some sort of delinquent, but as he began documenting his appearance, Shoyuta felt himself pause. Green, knotted hair, green eyes, freckles, probable deficiencies, bandages everywhere. Was this Hizashi's kid? Just as Shoyuta was about to reach for his phone to document this, the kid took the most panicked F-turn Shoyuta had ever seen, and nearly even disappeared on him if he hadn't have managed to turn a half-second later, albeit a bit louder than he would have liked. The kid went flying through the alleys between the few rows of houses lining the street with a practiced grace, making barely a sound as he moved. And then the kid disappeared. He lost sight of the DMN kid for a second, before the scuffing of gravel picked up his attention and almost sent him continuing forwards, if not for the lack of compensation footsteps following up the fake stumble. Well, if the kid's out this late, Shoyuta can always find him again. For now, he's still got a patrol to finish. Shoyuta woke up to the sound of his front door closing, signaling Hisashi's return from his Saturday afternoon radio shift. He rolled out of bed to perch upright on the side of it, running his hands along his face in an attempt to wake himself up. Shoyuta normally got minimal sleep as it was, let alone when he had some problem child running laps around his head all night. With a resigned huff, Shoyuta got up, slipping on a black pair of slippers and sliding across the hall, with no air of subtlety, towards the kitchen. Poking his head into the kitchen, he watched his somehow oblivious husband pull a couple ingredients from the cabinets and fridge, what with being the house's assigned chef. "Mornin'," Shoyuta grumbled, only to very nearly receive a carrot to the face, if not for his years-trained instincts leading him to catch it with a raised eyebrow, now most definitely startled awake, although not nearly as startled as Hisashi, who was currently pouting at him with a hand over his heart. "Gosh, Sho, I thought you were an intruder. What on earth has you up before?" Hisashi took the carrot from Shuta's hand with a sheepish grin as the man replied. "Sorry, I'm pretty sure I saw your kid last night." "The green kid you keep seeing," he grumbled out, pressing a hand to his mouth and yawning once he'd finished speaking. He was woken up more, however, by Hisashi about 4 inches away from his face with an extremely panicked expression. "The green bean. Why was he out when you were patrolling? Was he okay? Was he hurt?" Shoyuta quickly took to canceling Hisashi's quirk as he spoke, waiting for what seemed like the brink of a breakdown before interrupting him. "He wasn't dying or anything, just walking somewhere. He looked pretty dazed, not in a bad way or anything, and then he just legged it down the nearest alleyway and disappeared in about 30 seconds. Shoyuta shrugged, hoping his words would appease his husband, to no avail. "Do you think he knew you were there then? And what do you mean, not in a bad way? What is a good way to think about that?" This was going to be a long lunch. Chapter 19, Breaking News, Tomura Shigaraki has emotions. Somehow. Despite his hours of paranoid tossing and turning, Izuku had managed to fall asleep in a position that disagreed with his neck. Violently disagreed. If Izuku hadn't locked his door behind him, he'd be half convinced someone came into his room last night, snapped his neck, and then put it back in place with some kind of healing quirk before he woke up. This situation was not aided at all by the fact that his arms felt like they'd been beaten by DMN brooms with the way that not only mainly his forearms stung with the pulling of the bandages as he moved them, but also because he was so sore you'd think Dobby had him run a marathon hand-walking. Despite this, Izuku managed to find it in himself to drag himself from the sofa, trying to ease out his neck slightly in the process, before traipsing over to the kitchen and pulling the first thing he could reach out of the fridge, which happened to be a bell pepper by the looks of it. Taking a moment to eye its yellow color, with very little idea on how vegetables are supposed to work, he quickly decided he didn't care enough to figure it out, taking a very difficult bite out of the side of it, similar to how he had attempted to eat apples, coming to the conclusion that he had a new favorite vegetable. Was it even a vegetable, out of the maybe 7 he had tried throughout the course of his life? Making quick work of the pepper from there, and accidentally eating a couple seeds which led to variations of panic and disgust each time, Izuku threw the center and the stem, both of which he deemed too bitter to eat, into the bin, making his way to the bathroom, bracing himself in preparation for whatever was hiding under his current bandages. Once in the bathroom, he pulled his hoodie, shirt, and undershirt over his head, and God, maybe that was why he felt so warm, setting out a couple rolls of bandages onto the side of the sink in the process, his antiseptic already perched on the sink as he placed his clothes onto the toilet lid. After that, he pinched the edge of the bandage along his left arm and braced, before beginning to peel it off. Yep, he's definitely reopened a majority of his cuts whilst training. Gritting his teeth, Izuku beard the tugging of dried BLD against hair and skin alike as he unraveled the bandages at an excruciatingly slow pace in the hopes of not reopening anything more than he already had in order to remove them. 2 arms and 1 shoulder of bandages later, and Izuku was regretting every life choice he'd made. Believing he could do that seamlessly was not a very well thought out idea. Izuku was willing to say that at least half of the cuts along his forearms and a couple sections of his upper arm had all started bleeding within about 45 seconds of unraveling each arm, but he wouldn't be able to give an exact number because there was FBLD everywhere, since that's almost how wounds work, and he couldn't wash them off in his sink because it was still a mess of bandages and bullshit from his last bandage change. Mess, however, had never stopped Izuku from doing anything, and so he quickly picked up the handfuls of stuff in the sink, dropping them on the floor, stretching his arms even more in the process. Izuku spun the tap to what he thought was probably a reasonable temperature and flipping it on, only to be ambushed by absolutely ice-cold water. It was a little chilly at best, but let a guy be dramatic, blasting full pelt against his arms, washing away the BLD somewhat, but ultimately only making it more of an issue since now the cuts were definitely more open than before. Izuku made somewhat of an effort at cleaning up the BLD, before performing the quickest bandage job he thinks he's ever done, and that includes on school mornings, and slamming off the tap. What made this all even worse was the fact that now he had to try and wrap the burn on his shoulder without accidentally undoing the bandages around his arms. Easy enough. It was not easy enough. The bandages did in fact come undone, and Izuku was relatively confident that if his building were to do some sort of inspection on his apartment and enter his bathroom while he was out, nothing would actually happen, but if it were a normal apartment building, he'd almost certainly end up with a pending murder investigation. None of this mattered, however, as he ran as fast as he could, backpack thudding against his back, to the 24-hour cafe. It seems that tired Izuku last night had managed to make plans with Shigaraki while gaming, and didn't think to leave any reminder other than the chat left open on his phone. Which would have been a lot more helpful if he hadn't opened his phone for the first time that afternoon 8 minutes before they were supposed to meet up. Flying around the corner, he barely managed to slow his pace to not crash into the door, although it seemed the barista, weekends too. When isn't she working, had already heard him before he even opened the door. Was that a part of her quirk? Was it some sort of hearing amplification? What were the uses of the jacks then? Maybe we. Crow boy, you with us? The barista waved a hand in his direction, placing it back on the counter once his head snapped to face her. Nice observations. I think I'm going to take them as compliments. Anyways, your brother already ordered for you. He sat where you normally sit. Izuku froze for a moment, before looking over to the corner booth and seeing Shigaraki perched within it playing some sort of FPS game. Now, Izuku hates awkward situations. So he acted accordingly. Oh, thanks, I'll go, sit with my brother now. Well, Izuku was absolutely running out of that one. Swerving around tables, the cafe being slightly more busy on a weekend afternoon, although it looked to still be almost exclusively music and video game nerds, Izuku made a beeline for Shigaraki, thumping down onto the booth bench opposite him with a sigh. You're late. Shigaraki grumbled childishly, pushing his phone over to allow Izuku to see that he was, in fact, 2 minutes late. Sorry, I ran into a couple obstacles this morning. What, did you commit a murder? Shigaraki snorted, before looking up in a sudden excitement at the split second of silence. Wait, did you? Well, no, it only looks like it. Izuku attempted to defend himself, picking up the coffee with a doodle of a grumpy crow on it, taking note of the half-smudged cat on Shigaraki's drink. Tomura turned off his game with a sigh, having resigned to the fact that he was most definitely not going to finish his round now that his potential player 2 had chosen to sit opposite him. He didn't really know what stuck out about Midoriya. His stats seemed mediocre at best, he was as graceful as a camel on stilts, and had the functionality of a shittily pirated game. Maybe it was the fact he didn't seem as brain-dead as all the other NPCs he sees most days. Midoriya actually had the charisma to speak back to him, after all. Regardless, Tomura was beginning to feel some things he hadn't wanted to feel for a long time. Care. Responsibility. Trust. Needless to say, he would probably disintegrate someone in a heartbeat if he saw them attacking Midoriya, but then again, that'd probably alert Sensei to his existence, and Tomura didn't know how much he wanted that. In the past, he knew that he would have told Sensei about Midoriya the minute he saw him throw away that awful final boss Kirin, and yet, ever since Tomura was first introduced to those Nomus in training, he found himself a lot more wary. What if Midoriya had a powerful quirk? Or a quirk fit for a Nomu? Would Sensei take even Midoriya's quirk? Or would he turn Midoriya into a Nomu? Despite his friendship, was this what having a friend was like, with Tamura? Tamura didn't want to question it too much. Because then he'd end up questioning Sensei, and then Kurogiri would get stricter. It always happened when Sensei was annoyed at him. Maybe the NPC had some sort of latent empathy or soul-linking quirk, and then everything he'd worked so hard for under Sensei would fall apart. Hey, you good? You're staring at me like I nuked your firstborn. Midoriya glanced around with a worried expression, and only then had Tamura noticed he'd zoned out into his own thoughts, something he's never had to worry about feeling comfortable enough to do before. Oh, yeah, what did you say? He replied, blinking quickly in an attempt to compose his face. I was just saying, your food is going to get cold if you don't start eating it. If you didn't catch anything before that, it was just some quirk theory. Kinda stupid, but I like it. Midoriya looked even more cagey now that he'd said his last sentence, which led Tamura to the conclusion that Midoriya was expecting to be trolled over it. Which meant Tamura had people to find. As far as the food went, how does he say, I bought it for you because it looks like you'd pass out if you stood up too fast, and you'd break a bone, you're so fragile on the way down, without saying that. The food's for you. They had some shitty deals on, figured you could boost your energy stats since I ate before I came. That was a lie. He normally only had one consistent meal a day, the only one Sensei has Kurogiri consistently prepare for him, and most of his diet consisted of energy drinks and candy. And the occasional vegetable when Kurogiri managed to bribe him well enough. Midoriya had a look in his eye that Tamura really did not like, and oh my god, why is it crying? Chapter 20, what I'm asking is, are you about to jump off of this roof? Don't even get me started on All Might's costumes. Izuku groaned as he opened a different folder on his laptop, which opened to contain images of his costumes over the eras. Shigaraki took another sip of his drink, pinkies raised and an emotion covering his face that Izuku couldn't quite identify. Speaking of the way Shigaraki was holding his mug, Izuku had been thinking about it the entire time he was rambling. After Shigaraki made an attempt at calming him down as he ate the food, and he'd come to one conclusion: Shigaraki had a 5-point contact quirk. At first, he'd entertained the potential of his fingers being broken or something, but that was immediately disregarded when Izuku watched Shigaraki scratch at his neck with all 4 fingers. But why would he be avoiding the quirk? It'd have to be something destructive, based on the way he acted with it. Or he didn't have full control over the quirk. Or both. Izuku, like the socially adept genius he was, decided to ask about it, looking away from the laptop screen he'd set between the two of them and towards Shigaraki. Hey, do you have a 5-point contact quirk? It's just you've been avoiding touching everything with your pinkies, it's the only reason I can think of. Izuku watched as Shigaraki froze up, a hand reaching up to resume scratching at his neck again, something that had only happened a couple times in their conversation when he ended up lost in his thoughts for too long. Why do you care? Shigaraki hissed out, body tense as if stuck between fight or flight. I don't, I was just wondering. In case I didn't make it clear, quirk discrimination isn't exactly one of my life's blessings. Izuku attempted to defuse the situation, flashing a smile in hopes that it did literally anything, and to Izuku's luck, something in Shigaraki seemed to open up. Shigaraki spoke with an intense expression, staring Izuku in the eye in some sort of untold warning. My quirk is called Decay. It allows me to disintegrate anything I touch with all 5 fingers, including the destruction of people. Well, now Izuku sees why Shigaraki was pushed to where he is. He allows the words to sink in for a moment, before, with a look of determination, beginning to rummage through his bag. He used to keep his analysis books in the back, within a zipped pocket, and he was fairly confident the artist gloves he used to use when sketching costumes were still in there, since he didn't remember digging them out when removing everything from his bag. After a moment of silence and Shigaraki looking ready to fly out of his own skin, Izuku let out a triumphant huff as he pulled the pair of black aforementioned gloves from his bag, offering them out to Shigaraki with a smile. What are those? Shigaraki asked hesitantly, still looking as if he was mentally bracing for something. Artist gloves. They only cover a couple of your fingers, and these ones are double-layered, since it used to help my hand cramps for when I drew too long, so unless they get torn or anything it'd be pretty difficult to disintegrate them. Izuku placed them down in front of Shigaraki, taking a sip of his drink in order to ease the pressure a bit. With enough caution you'd think they were bombs, Shigaraki picked up the gloves, carefully maneuvering one onto his right hand, before slowly placing each finger onto his mug, until finally pressing his thumb against it. Tomura would probably be crying right now, if he were Izuku. But he's not, so instead he'll stick to trying to decipher the emotional whirlwind this demon child has managed to leave in his gut. As much as he wanted to put it on, he left the second glove on the table for now. He already felt weak as it was without a hand's worth of power at his disposal, let alone if he were to be unable to protect himself with his quirk. He also didn't want to accidentally harm the gloves. Sure, they are just some artist's gloves, but they were Izuku's gloves, which meant Tomura would keep them safe for him. He'd need to hide them from Sensei, though, he wouldn't want anything to happen to them. After a run home through the more sketchy parts of town in order to help him acclimate a bit, Izuku found himself laid on his back on the sofa, a video call open on his laptop next to him as he ranted to the purple-haired boy on the other side of the screen. All I'm saying, imagine how powerful Eraserhead would be if he just F-winked. Izuku announced, raising his hands upwards as if to emphasize his point. Yeah, but what if people thought he was going for a midnight vibe with it? What, pro-hero Eraserhead has employed a new tactic and it's flirting with the villains. Imagine getting arrested by one of Mizutafu's most feared underground heroes and as he's tightening his F-scarf around you and he just winks at you. By this point, they were both barely getting their words out through unintelligible wheezes, something that not helped when Shinso let out a breathy, the bench hero, while this conversation was looking productive. Izuku had been thinking a lot about rooftops recently. Wait. No. Not in that way. Ever since he had been followed by that person by roofs, Izuku had been wondering if he should figure out how to travel across rooftops. It seemed practical compared to just walking across the streets. Also he thought he'd look pretty badass if he figured out how to drop into crimes from the sky if he could figure out how to do that without snapping his legs. Regardless, that is how Izuku found himself. Stumbling between rooftops in full crow attire in the middle of the night, in hopes of limiting recognizability, somehow not falling to his death along the way. His fingertips were stained black from oil, having been messing with some of the scraps in his living room and making some sort of combinations of objects. He kind of wanted to take some of them out with him, but he didn't really want to risk breaking anything before it was secure. Izuku cannot tell if it's the residual suicidality from when he actually attended school, but something was compelling him to feel like he was having the time of his life as he leapt across the gaps between buildings, his already existent agility helping him immensely. He would say he should have taken up running across rooftops earlier, but Izuku does not trust his past self's regard for his safety any more than he does his current self, which speaks volumes. Eventually, once he'd exhausted himself enough that he was stumbling again like he had at the start of the evening, he perched himself onto the edge of an apartment building roof, watching the occasional car whiz by with an idle expression. Now that he had time to think, he felt a lot of things dawn on him from when he was last sat on a roof. They pretty much all revolved around one thing however, Kaken was never Izuku's friend to begin with. Sure, maybe in that childlike innocence, before the universe decided to descend Izuku's life into SHT, Kaken might have been slightly nicer, but he was always making sure he was above Izuku. And if Izuku didn't want to believe that fact, then the blistered burns on his shoulder would make him. Just as he was thinking that, Izuku heard a thud on the rooftop behind him, signaling the approach of someone else. Spinning around quickly from where he was, he takes in the dark figure in front of him, trying to force his eyes to adjust to the darkness now that he wasn't facing the street lamps, only to find himself facing Eraserhead. Oh my god, it's Eraserhead. Izuku honestly didn't know whether to scream in excitement or terror, a feeling that was only amplified when he caught the look in Eraserhead's eye. Hey, Eraserhead. Fancy seeing you here. Izuku watched as Eraserhead hesitated a moment at the use of his name, before resetting his focus onto Izuku. Hey, kid, are you okay? New update, Eraserhead had the emotional social capacity of a teaspoon. He was trying to comfort Izuku. Why was he trying to comfort Izuku? Yeah, I'm fine, just chilling. Izuku shrugged, taking in Eraserhead's incredulous expression. Why are you looking at me like that? What I'm asking is, are you about to jump off of this roof? Eraserhead asked, and then the scene clicked in Izuku's head. Yeah, the average person generally looks pretty suicidal when they are sat on the edge of a roof thinking about their childhood best friend turned bully. Go figure. Oh, no, I'm fine. Just thinking. Izuku was not doing a very good job at defending his case, as it seemed when Eraserhead approached, sitting down on the rooftop with a couple meters between him and the sitting Izuku. After a moment's silence, Eraserhead began to speak. You're Crow, correct? He recognized Izuku. The Eraserhead recognized Izuku. Well, yeah, he was working on Izuku's case, but come on, they hadn't even met yet. What's it to you? I like to put names to faces is all. You've certainly got an interesting image of you painted with the higher-ups at the station. Oh. Care to share? It's not very often new vigilantes especially have the people they stop waking up in fear of them is all, DMN, all Izuku did was what they deserved. What a couple of wimps. Hey, they got what was coming to them. I don't doubt that. If anything, I'm glad you stopped them, at least. One of them was aiming for heroics. I can say for a fact we'd rather have you than them. Izuku felt slightly bitter as he heard this, the ever-present reminder in the back of his mind that isn't really true, that it's conditional until they find out about his quirk, or lack thereof. Heroics isn't an option for me, and I wouldn't die on that hill of yours.